Welcome, everyone, to episode 31 of the Argument Clinic podcast. My name is Martin Sigalo, and I am not joined by my lovely co-host Lawrence, unfortunately. He apparently has better things to do than spend time with me, sad face. But regardless, we are the Argument Clinic podcast. We are a podcast designed to, focusing on the fundamentals of debate. Whether you're a grizzled veteran of the tournament scene, someone who's just going to their very first tournament, someone who wants to teach their kids how to get good at debate, this is the podcast for you. We focus on the fundamentals of debate and try and get everyone as good as possible. This is a free online podcast and resource to help you all do that. So where in the world have Martin and Lawrence been? So I went to a debate tournament at the Bronx High School of Science this past weekend. Before that, I went to a local tournament, and we did really, really great at both, and it was so gratifying. I got to see at the Bronx High School of Science this extremely hardworking competitor who dedicates a lot of time to debate from my school win the tournament. Shout out to Julia Wu for winning Bronx. And I also, the previous weekend, got to see some of our novices at their very first tournament when they are still pure, do extremely well. And one of them won that tournament as well. And a lot of the kids did very well and got 2-1 records. And stuff like that. So that was also very gratifying. Really, it's been a wholesome couple of weeks, which is not to say that I've slept well, because I have certainly not. But anyway, so that's what I've been doing, and obviously just teaching the class that I teach at school. Okay, so before we get further, I want to give a shout out to the Victory Briefs podcast. Victory Briefs is an incredibly good debate camp and brief service. They are really one of the best in the nation. Their camps are really big for a reason. I don't know if they've opened up next year's camp sessions, but I would definitely check them out as soon as they are available. I will say that the Victory Briefs has been helpful in the past in terms of having Lake Highland get some good W's, especially on the last topic where there was some really good topic analysis, especially one by Jake Nebel, which we used to win some rounds. So I definitely think that if you want a holistic understanding, you should sign up for the Victory Briefs. And they also have this card of the day thing that apparently they do that Lawrence always talks about, which I always find funny because I think all cards are kind of free unless they're behind a paywall. So I don't know exactly what they mean, but I think he means that card of the day, you just get a card just for showing up or something, and then somehow that's good. But anyways, so there's also a bunch of new debate articles, which are nice, and that's cool. Anyway, so this is a scholarship episode. Of course, this is an episode on the topic analysis for the November-December 2018 resolution. We hope that we get this topic, out early enough to at least prepare for your first tournaments. We are recording this in sort of the late week of October 18, 19, 20, stuff like that. So we hope that you all will be able to benefit from that as soon as possible and use that to construct cases and etc. So this topic is really a doozy. So we're going to have to get in depth with it. And I also have 3 incredible guests that, of course, you all know from looking at the description of this podcast. But this is the most guests we've ever had on a podcast before. And this is really awesome. We're really excited to have all of them. And I'll introduce them after the break. So anyway, when we come back, we'll always do what we do for every new topic. We'll talk about what the topic means. We'll talk about affirmative arguments on the topic. And we'll talk about negative arguments on the topic. After that, of course, we'll get into the only part of our podcast that actually matters, which is the irrelevant mini debate at the end, and etc. So when we come back, we'll talk about the topic. All right, so I'm joined by 3 amazing guests. We have Jack Ave, Lindsey McNamara, and Charles Karcher. Let's everyone just create a cacophony by saying hello at roughly the same time. Hello.
Hello.
All right, great. We did it. Okay. All right. So I'll start with Jack. So I've known Jack for a really long time. She graduated in 2013, right? You were Julian's year. Jack is a prolific debate coach. He coaches. You're still at Polytech, right?
Poly Prep Country Day School in Brooklyn.
Poly Prep. I was so close. Okay. Yeah. So Jack is great. He's been a really successful debate coach. And at one point, correct me if I'm wrong, you coached both of the other people on the podcast, right?
Yeah. I coached Lindsey McNamara for about 2.5 years, and Charles for his senior year.
Speaking about them as if they aren't there, that's funny. Yes, but anyway, Jack is a really successful coach, and I'm really excited to have him on. Lindsey, I judged so many times, just a ridiculous number of times.
Yeah.
Lindsey was a fabulous debater from William T. Dwyer High School, right? Yeah. I got the T. And Lindsey did really well. Got bids to the Tournament of Champions. Introduce yourself, Lindsey.
I'm Lindsey. I go to University of Florida. I did high school LD specifically for 4 years, and then dabbled in college policy.
Yeah. Same. Did some dabbling. I eventually undabbled myself.
Yeah.
Policy, but, you know, like you do. Anyway, so Charles, he just graduated last year, and I judged Charles twice. Charles got to quarterfinals of the Florida State tournament, which is a very difficult tournament to get far in. And I also judged him in quarterfinals of Blue Key, at which he got a bid to the Tournament of Champions. So Charles is a great guy, and I promised to give him a shout out on one of the episodes, but then I didn't. So here's your shout out, Charles Karcher. Shout out to Charles Karcher. Now Charles Karcher can introduce himself as the best shout out of all time.
Hi there, I'm Charles. I did high school LD for my junior and senior year, and before that I did Congress and PF, and now I'm doing some college policy.
Congress. I tried out for Congress.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm a time now qualifier in Congress.
Whoa.
Yeah, you read Butler at the qual tournament, right?
I did. I read Butler. I read
It's tremendous. Tremendous. So are you the only one to have done Congress? Lindsey, did you do Congress at any point?
Dabbled. I did Congress at a couple locals, just to kind of like be there for my team if LD wasn't happening at the locals.
I see. Very nice.
I'll give a quick plug to this. I think a lot of people in the debate community sometimes don't diversify the events that they do. And I think both Charles, Lindsey, and all Charles, Lindsey, and I at least really benefited from participating in public forum and congressional debate. And I did some speech events as well. And I think it really helped me in LD quite a bit with speaker points. So yeah, I definitely, if anyone's listening, anyone's inspired to take up a Congress tournament or two, you'll definitely learn something.
I couldn't agree more with that. That's a very accurate analysis.
Well, I never did it, so I can't really speak about that. But these are some trustworthy folks. So they wouldn't lead you astray. So okay, so as we talked about before the break, what we're going to do is first, for this section, we are going to talk about what the resolution means. And for this topic, it's just truly an incredible venture to have to do. So incredible undertaking. So we're going to do that. And then in the next section, we'll talk about affirmative and negative arguments and, some of the main arguments that we think you should be making and researching, etc. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to just go over the resolution, and we're going to go over what every term in the resolution means. What we'll try and do is build in discussions of the topic from those words and what they mean. And then at the end, we'll just give some sort of observations about how we think the topic is going to go in terms of the arguments that we think will fly. And on some episodes, this is kind of going to be a light section, but I think that on this topic, it'll be a pretty deep section. Now, we'll obviously mention a lot of the concepts before when we're talking about some of the specific phrases. One thing, by the way, that we've decided to do on this episode also is do some of the – so first we're just going to tell you the resolution. We're going to repeat it a couple times. So for those of you who are just listening, you can get a sense of what it is. And this one, you might really want to write down. And what we are going to do is after that is we're going to go through the words in the resolution, but not necessarily in the order that they're presented. I think that for this topic, it actually makes sense to go out of order because a lot of words at the beginning sort of you just don't know what they mean, or they're very misleading if you don't start from the end of the resolution. Okay, so Jack, Charles, Lindsey, you guys ready to start?
Yep.
Yes, I am.
Awesome. So Charles, you wanna hook us up with a reading of the resolution? Just read it as if you're doing student Congress. Just really persuade me about this resolution.
So the resolution is, quote, in a democracy, the public's right to know ought to be valued above the right to privacy of candidates for public office.
Great. So Lindsey, why don't you see if you can read it more persuasively?
In a democracy, the public's right to know ought to be valued above the right to privacy of candidates for public office.
I think that was like pretty much the same.
Pretty tied.
I think you both earned the high speaker points of 27 in Florida. At the very least, you know. Someone's like,
Okay.
"Oh, excellent, 27."
27. Yep. Okay.
27 are not excellent. But that's okay. So so we have, in a democracy, the public's right to know ought to be valued above the right to privacy of candidates for public office. So we're going to talk about a bunch of the important phrases in the resolution, and this resolution has arguably like 5 or more prepositional phrases.
Mm-hmm.
So just truly a lot of qualification. We'll talk about each of the words that are important in turn. So, in a democracy. So Jack, democracy, is that a term that that everyone agrees on what it means, or is that a term where there's like a lot of people with random nitpicky definitions of it?
I would say there's definitely a lot of random definitions or different interpretations of what a democracy means. I think this caveat as the first part of the resolution, I think is really interesting to think about in terms of conceptually what are the fundamentals constitutive of a democracy that would necessitate either an affirmation or negation of the resolution. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I think that the different forms of democracy, I think definitely play a role.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that this term is incredibly important, as much for what it says as it is for what it doesn't say. But one of my favorite definitions of democracy, and it says so much about me that I'm a debate coach that I have a favorite definition of democracy. But I think one of my favorite definitions of democracy that I read in an article somewhere is, like, I don't know the exact phrasing, but it's something like, quote, "a society where the ruling party regularly loses elections."
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is like a very interesting definition, right? But then it's like, because the thing is, it's not just the voting, right? But I mean, so
Right.
democracy obviously includes, voting, or in some sense, or some form of direct political participation. The citizenry has to like be involved. It's not just like there's one person voting. But I just think that also people don't think it's a democracy where it only really has one party that can never actually win. And so people are like, oh, you have to actually be able to lose. I think it's kind of a funny definition.
Yeah, that's interesting for sure.
But definitely, like, there'll be a lot of debates that you all have where you will go into the debate and you'll have a definition of democracy, and your opponent's definition will be like slightly different. Now, ultimately, though, democracy has a fundamental thing of political participation. So, Lindsey, political participation in the context of democracy, what do you think? Like, can you just explain that to us?
Yeah, so I would say that political participation would be anywhere from like active voting to active protesting, just active like conversation in politics. I think that voting is like definitely a necessity of democracy, but other things like protesting and other like forms of involvement are like additional.
Yeah, definitely voting is like a necessary thing. But, just because you're voting, I mean, people voted for Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
It's like not by itself, but you're I mean, yeah, you're definitely right. Like if it doesn't have voting, it's probably not really democratic. But I really like how you highlighted protesting. I mean, it's just, citizenry being engaged with their government, controlling how it goes themselves, really important. So Charles, is a really important thing. So the last resolution differs from this resolution in the prepositional phrase that's at the beginning, right? The last one had something else. It did say in, but where did it say it was in? Charles, you there?
Sorry, in the United States.
Yeah. In the United States.
Right, so it specified a location.
Yeah, and this one says in a democracy. So guys, I think this is a really important difference. Charles, can you talk to us about why this difference might be like extremely significant? Like a lot of resolutions have in the United States in them, right? And this resolution doesn't. So how do you think that might like affect some of the arguments that people can present?
Sure. So I think that the arguments on this topic are going to be they're going to have to be much more in general, and that implicates kind of the examples that debaters use in round, because since it's not specified to the United States, it's just democracy in general. It's questioning a hypothetical democracy, and it's questioning what values a democracy hypothetically should be upholding.
Yeah, definitely.
Rather than the specific United States, which is its own country, which has its own interpretation of democracy and has like 200 years of precedence of, what democratic values we prioritize and which ones we don't prioritize.
Yeah, I actually think that nowhere is this more restrictive than this topic. I think in this topic, the fact that the resolution doesn't say in the United States, this is the most ground I've ever seen that lack of phrasing cost people. And we'll talk about that sort of towards the end when we do the observations. Okay, so how about an easier word? Not the easiest word in the resolution, but candidates. So Jack, when you think of a candidate, who do you think of?
So candidates are people who are trying to persuade the active populace, which are people who have the ability to vote, or usually have the ability to participate in the public, I guess. Similar to how Lindsey talked about with like activism or protests, even, are those forms of political participation. Those people who could hold a representative accountable or potentially give them power. So a candidate is someone who's seeking power, usually to maintain or to gain power within the government, to really represent people within a democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing. So how about this, Charles? So you, of course, red-blooded American citizen, right? What do you do with candidates? There's one particular thing that you do that is relevant to the
I vote for them.
Yeah, or you don't, right? Yeah. You either vote for them or you don't. So they're the people that you are deciding to get into it. Now remember, like in terms of pure classical Athenian democracy, right? There's no representatives. There's no real candidates. You just vote for your policies directly. But this resolution assumes a sort of representative system, as Jack was saying, right?
Sure.
That you elect people into office. And etc. So candidates, I think, count as sort of one of two types. So I think first of all, you could say that candidates are citizens. They're just normal citizens, and they maybe want to not be normal citizens forever, but that's true. And then of course there are also people who are currently part of the government and running for re-election. Jenny, you all know what that's called, right? The term for that?
An incumbent.
An incumbent, exactly. I had to explain to multiple people what that term meant today. So yes, an incumbent. So you have people that are already part of the government that are asking to be re-elected. So it's kind of citizens versus not. So at the beginning of this topic, I kind of played a game with myself, thinking like, is this a candidate or is this isn't a candidate? So at the beginning of the topic, so Lindsey, let me ask you this question, because I think this is like legitimately a vague question, and until I looked it up, I did not know the answer. So what is your view on whether or not Supreme Court nominees are candidates?
See, I probably wouldn't say that they are candidates.
Right, and that was my original thought at the very beginning of the topic. I was like, a candidate is something you vote for, right? But like, we don't vote for the candidates. It's sort of just like put into place, you know?
I think my initial take was much different than that, Martin and Lindsey.
Mm-hmm.
I think definitely if we think of a candidate as someone who like a populace or the populace is giving power to, and if we already have given power, it seems, to representatives like our Senate members, for example, my Senate member is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley. I give my power to him. I believe he's supposed to still represent me on some level. And so I feel as though that if someone is seeking an office that is, such as the Supreme Court on some level, or even any court level, on a federal level as well, similar to like court packing that may exist with stuff that's happening with Trump, which may be a relevant topic area, if you believe that judges could be candidates. If I'm supposed to elect a candidate through this manner, someone through this manner, I think that a Supreme Court judge could be affected. However, I do want to add oh, go ahead.
Well, so I think that originally I was with Lindsey until I started looking some stuff up, and apparently the definition of a candidate just includes the term nominee for an office.
Yeah,
so if someone
I just Googled it, and now
right,
I'm
yeah,
at it.
yeah, isn't that weird? Because I was like really sure when the day the topic came out that it wasn't about the Supreme Court, and then I just looked up a definition, and I was like, wait, really? Like that's actually the definition. So yeah, I think candidates do include nominees to the Supreme Court. Now here's the thing, right? Let's talk for a minute about elections. So and sort of like who they are. So here's a question for perhaps Charles if he knows.
Sure.
So local judges, right? A judge
Yes.
your local area.
Yes.
How do they get into power?
We vote.
We vote for them. That's exactly right. So they are just straightforwardly candidates.
Right.
Local judges. Now, Supreme Courts, they get nominated and voted on by the Congress. Those people
Right.
are also straightforwardly candidates. And here's the thing: federal judges are literally just appointed. Is my understanding.
Yes.
They are just appointed by the executive branch. However, I think that under this resolution definition, candidates as well. And of course, you can have candidates for all sorts of things, right? You, as the next term in the resolution is public office, the least restrictive phrase in the resolution, obviously it can't just be a random corporation, right? But almost any level of government, I think, counts. For example, like if you are running for like a random local chair of some environmental watchdog organization that's technically part of your local government, I mean, you're a candidate, right? You're running for public office. The resolution does sort of apply to you. Not that there would really be much of a public right to know about your stuff.
Interesting. Okay, I haven't thought about it in that manner.
But so like here's so here's the thing, right? Technically, and obviously, right, the presidential election is going to be the biggest one,
Right.
and as well as the Senate, congressional elections, House of Representatives. But what I will say is that although it's kind of fun to think about all the different kinds of candidates that there are in terms of like, oh, look at all these random people that the resolution could theoretically be about, I am just pretty sure that those people who are candidates don't have a lot of rights to privacy, and therefore the resolution just doesn't really, even though the word candidate doesn't restrict them, they're sort of functionally restricted in the sense that like the resolution is technically about them, but like not really. It's just never
Right.
apply.
Okay.
So for reasons we'll talk about in terms of this resolution being very restrictive, I don't think that really counts. But it is kind of fun to think about like, oh, I guess there's just like actually a lot of different people that this applies to technically. So again, the key distinctions that we drew here. Number one, we drew a distinction between incumbents and people running for election the first time. And that distinction is important to recognize because one of those groups, the incumbents, is already part of the government and the other group isn't. And then the second thing we talked about is, who counts? What are the local elections counts? Do random nominees count for various positions? If they're voted for, yes. Supreme Court counts. A lot of the different court appointees count. The Senate counts. Random local governments count. But also they sort of don't count, as I mentioned before. All right, so let's very quickly talk about this next phrase, public office. Basically, a lot of what would normally be added by the phrase public office is just already in the word candidate. So it's not really like that important of a phrase, but it just means that like if you are running for like, I don't know, Walmart elections or something, then it wouldn't apply. By the way, guys, I'm pretty sure that one of my students came into my class and was like, maybe we could technically talk about like schools. And then
like what type of positions?
Like student government in a high school.
And
I just like sat there and I was like, I'm really angry with you, but that like might be topical.
Actually,
right? Because it's like it's for public office, in a thing. Maybe the school is kind of democratic, it's run democratically. Maybe, I mean, you're a candidate. I mean, the office is public. You don't really have any rights to privacy, but whatever.
so Martin, briefly, just to clarify, you said earlier, like for example, in an environmental watchdog group, if they had elections, that would be a public election because they're a watchdog group, and that's inherently public.
No. I just meant if it was somehow part of the government, like.
Oh, okay, sure, gotcha.
If the government contracts out to an NGO to watch them or whatever, you're right. I'm sorry for being confusing about that.
All good.
Because I use the term watchdog group, which is normally like not your part of the government because you're not
right.
the dog. You're the dog, not the watchdog or
yeah.
I mixed the hell out of that metaphor, but whatever. But yeah, so the point is like if there's a part of the government that's like designed to just like watch and ensure compliance with EPA regulations or something.
Okay,
There's
fair.
that, I guess, right? Then that would be sort of topical, but you don't have any privacy, so who cares?
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about the. Oh, sorry. Did someone have something to say?
Yeah, my bad. So I think that something to really touch on speaking of students is especially in the United States at state-funded universities, a lot of the like student government, president, vice president, even the board are paid through the university, which maybe would mean they're a public entity. They're still elected by students. And I do know that like privacy can be a huge issue. I'm aware of on a campus in my state of an issue of someone outing someone who's running for a president, her past history with other students in an intimate sense that would have harmed her image. And so it was kind of a big question of whether or not the university could censor that sort of like, discussion.
Very interesting. Now that's like very obnoxiously close to the resolution, right? It's like very, very, very close. That's very interesting. I guess some student government people in the college setting really do apply.
Because I think too.
Very neat.
Yeah. I think that it could be a very hyper-specific focus on the topic.
Yeah. More like a kind of example, like that's kind of compelling, right?
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some of these other phrases in the resolution. So what we have here is we have two different rights. And the topic demands that we kind of balance those rights against each other. And we'll talk about that really at length in a moment. But so the resolution says ought to be valued above. Now, of course, everyone has had the ought that was in the last resolution. It means something to do with morality, justice, rightness, that it's not just a policy question. It's also a values question, or at least it's possible to be a values question. So we're not really going to talk about the ought part of the resolution because we do that on every single topic. It does mean something morally related. But the resolution says valued above. So, Lindsey, what does it mean to you when a resolution says X ought to be valued above Y?
So the term valued above, I liken a lot to the term when in conflict, and it's just a question of the extent of the right to know and when the two would actually be coming in conflict. So I think that a lot of candidates' privacy just wouldn't really be relevant because it wouldn't be in the extent of the right to know. But I think that would be up to a lot of debaters on how they decide to construct right to know.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think it's like a really, really important concept to understand in the case of this resolution. So Lindsey, right, if there was a resolution that was like, is this resolution the same as like the public ought to have a right to know, period?
I don't think so.
Yeah, definitely not, right?
Yeah. The resolution like contextualizes what the right to know is specific to, because it would be specific to the candidate's privacy. So I think that there's like more specificity in the resolution here, but I still think that the resolution is really vague and that debaters should be defining both like the right to know and candidates' privacy.
Yeah, of course. Now, of course, sort of the flip side of that is the resolution is also not just resolved candidates ought not have privacy rights.
Yeah.
Right? It's
a question of the two.
Yeah. I just want to really highlight that thing you said, right? Just when they conflict. So the resolution isn't about are these rights things. The question is when you have those rights and one of them applies and the other one applies, how do you rank them? The resolution is really a ranking question, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think this is like a really vital phrase to understand about the resolution. And I just want to really, really emphasize it because I think it determines a lot of the debate on this topic. So again, to be clear, just saying that the public should know a lot does not affirm the resolution.
Yeah.
And yeah. And then just saying that people should have lots of privacy also doesn't negate the resolution, right? The idea is where is there a conflict between those things? When there's a conflict, which should we have? And I think that this allows you strategically to really get a lot of stuff. I think it allows you, for example, to say that if your opponent's argument is just very general about why privacy is good, you can say, Yeah, I can agree with you about that. But can also say, hey, I'm not saying we should get rid of privacy. I'm just saying this one time we should have the right to know. And I think that those arguments are very persuasive on topics like this. Do you agree, Charles? Or do you think that or do you think something else? Do you disagree?
So I think that it's often very easy to fall into the trap, like you said earlier, of just defending that the public has a right to know in the abstract as the affirmative, and then just saying on the negative, the flip side of that, and just saying that, candidates ought to have privacy. But in debates like these, especially with the wording of this resolution, it's very important to have comparative analysis in not only like your final speeches, but also from the get-go, from the fence, because to convince judges, especially in more traditional settings, that yes, like the candidate's right to privacy, like yes, that can be a good thing in the abstract, but compared to the public's right to know, it's simply not outweighed.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's like a vital concept to understand when we
Yes.
get actually into these issues.
And also, I think that if you understand that more than your opponent, that can kind of like catch them off guard, because like a lot of people, when I went into rounds on topics like this, I didn't really think about that a lot. But then if the opponent says like, yes, like I agree with the majority of your affirmative case, it's just that in certain instances we need to question what values we weigh. That definitely, can turn the tables.
Yeah, so when Lindsey and I were talking before the podcast actually started, we mentioned that this resolution is very similar to another resolution, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But one of the best cards I think I've ever cut, I have like a pretty short list of them. It's like 5 long, and one of them was for that topic, and that was because an author specifically said, because the topic was about the right to know versus national security, and the card said, hey, everyone likes both right to know and national security. So it's just a question of balancing, and you should balance this one. And it was like so explicit, and I just loved it. And I demanded all my debaters put it in their case.
Right. Awesome.
All right. So now the nitty gritty. We've kind of avoided talking about the main sort of noun phrases of the resolution, but now we're going to get right into it. But I think that this resolution, so I'm going to read the resolution just one more time. In a democracy, the public's right to know ought to be valued above the privacy of candidates valued above the right to privacy of candidates for public office. So the two phrases here we have are the public's right to know, and we have the right to privacy. But I actually think that if you start with the right to know, you are going to put yourself in a disservice when you do research, for reasons that we will talk about shortly. I think really what this resolution is about is the second round phrase, the right to privacy. So Jack, what is your understanding of the right to privacy? And this can be either in like the context of U.S. legal or just like generally philosophically how it works. I know you know a lot about the right to privacy, so just hit me with it.
Yeah, so I actually know a lot about privacy from the right to be forgotten topic from a couple of years ago. Do you remember that topic, Martin?
1 year I wasn't coaching.
You really missed out. You really missed out. So on that topic, I think philosophically, the way that I learned about privacy, the way I think about privacy now, is fundamentally about self-ownership, about controlling information about you. This could be information about maybe messages you could have sent to someone. This could be maybe information about your medical history that you wouldn't want to disclose, or maybe would want to disclose. Or just fundamentally, it's the control of that information and who has access to it, which is privacy.
Right, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think for some people, and for legal scholars especially, it's really hard to define what privacy is, and especially the right to privacy and what it means. But that was a very succinct definition. You have some sense of control over your information and where it gets distributed. There's some information about you, and you don't want other people to know about it.
Yeah, and it looked like legal norms focused around property rights, seeming to be able to track different empirical, like this is property information, like the non-disclosure agreement with doctors, or like how that information is treated. And so I think that the way we think about privacy is intimately related to property.
Property right.
Yes.
Very interesting. So so you mentioned some stuff that sort of the right to privacy applies to. So Lindsey, in terms of the right to privacy, are there like a lot of things that you have the right to privacy about, you as a person?
Well, I actually wanted to jump in really quick just
Okay.
back on what we were saying about the public's right to know. Just out of curiosity, y'all were talking about the confidentiality in regards to doctors. It didn't pop into my head when I was writing a topic analysis or like doing research, but what about the confidentiality between like a lawyer and a candidate?
Attorney-client privilege, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be really interesting. I think us giving a current example right now is what's unfolding with Trump's former lawyer or former legal team, and how the information or the discussion that was had with a candidate and his legal team is now under scrutiny.
Very interesting.
Also, sorry if this is not the right section for this, but that kind of begs the question of, is the resolution questioning candidates in the status quo or someone who used to be a candidate who is now an elected official?
Well, I think that answer to that question is probably easier. It's probably no.
Okay.
Because then the candidates really does just mean anything.
But if
that's true. But what about when they were?
Because then like President Trump, no, that would make President Bush a candidate right now.
Well, let's add a caveat then, is that I think that in a lot of different regimes outside of the United States, or even with like in the United States, is that a lot of leaders can rerun or already are planning to rerun even before they swear in. So do we treat that current sitting governor or city council person or president and assume they're still a candidate even though it's not a campaign year? Like what does
I feel like that's a fuzzy area that we have to figure out.
My guess is that the distinction is just in whatever legal system you are, when you apply to be in the next election, you're a candidate now, probably. Even if you haven't started like running the campaign.
That's like after that deadline.
I think as a negative on this topic, they might be fundamentally suspect of that claim, because it seems like that is very, very like hard to draw for an affirmative to say, oh, like the right to know only applies in 1 year. However, during this three-year presidency, like this is not necessarily something that would differ. Right.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a question of do we also apply the right to know to elected officials in a different way? And I don't know. I feel like that's just an interesting question on the topic.
It is an interesting question, and I think there's some legitimate ambiguity. My personal thought is that those people are not candidates, but I do think that there are some ways it could go either way.
Yeah, I'll disagree. Yeah.
So as far So as far as the right to privacy is concerned, here's the thing. People have rights to privacy about all sorts of things, right? I have a lot of rights to privacy, and so does Charles, so does Lindsey, so does Jack. But the thing is, your rights to privacy dramatically decrease when you are under public scrutiny.
Exactly.
So you have so there are things. So one of the sort of key things in privacy rights is you sort of don't have the right to come into my house and film me without my consent. Or at least the government doesn't. However, if I'm just like running through the street naked and someone like takes a video of me and posts it on the internet, I can't be like, my privacy. Right?
Because you're in the public space.
Yes, because I voluntarily entered the public space and sort of surrendered myself to that. And that's what a lot of the issues on this topic are about. They're about, so normally, right, people have a lot of rights to privacy, but should candidates have a right to privacy about that thing? But I also I want to talk about the right to know, and then I really want to come back to this question, because I think that the right to privacy is the core issue on this resolution, and we should really get into it. So Lindsey, as I mentioned before, you debated a topic with the right to know, and I judged it. Now, and I coached it, and I really liked the topic. That topic had to do, and I forget the exact wording, but it was something like the people's right to know ought to be valued above the government's need for secrecy. Something like that. And that topic that's because a lot of the literature about a right to know is about governments versus the people. It's about secrecy. It's about transparency, right?
Exactly. And like checks on corruption, that was one of the big arguments that I ran, was like transparency is key to checking corruption. Like the public's right to know is key to just like check any type of government secrets,
Yeah.
and making sure that they're legitimate.
Yeah, I did so much research on that resolution, and like it was, but then like, and then I like got to the tournament, and like every single AF was just like democratic accountability good, and every neg was like security good, and I was like, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Like,
but I think a lot of debaters are going to conflate that resolution with this resolution when
I
they're
I 100% agree. Can you tell us why?
Yeah.
And
So
why they're different?
yeah. So the right to know, generally when you type it in to just any search engine, it'll normally give you articles relating to the previous topic that we were talking about, the government's need for secrecy. I would argue that that's different than the candidates' privacy because they aren't necessarily part of the government yet. They're also like a citizen. And the need for the public's right to know definition would be different in both of those contexts.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like a lot of debaters are going to try to use the right to know definition in the context of government's need for secrecy on this topic when it doesn't apply.
Definitely. And it's also not just about the definitions, right? It's just about, like, as you said, right, a lot of the literature that says right to know is good. Like, if you are debating someone and they're just like, read a bunch of cards that the right to know is good, and none of those cards mention privacy, they basically have not affirmed the resolution.
Exactly.
Right? Because their cards will almost certainly just say the government should tell us things about their deep inner workings. Right? It's like, but that doesn't apply to just like some dude from Minnesota who really wants to run for the state House of Representatives.
That's why I think especially affirmative debaters should be suspect of a lot of the links that security negs make, or arguments that people might make that we need a right to know to like protect against like an I don't know, so some sort of a terrorist threat I think be overblown very easily in some rounds. So just be skeptical of those claims.
Yeah, if I was affirmative and my opponent started reading cards about how the right to know causes terrorism, I would pump the fist. like in view of the judge, I'd be like, yes. Right, because like definitely just none of their cards are about the resolution.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, when I was doing my initial topic research, I came to the conclusion personally that I wasn't convinced that spending any time on security positions on the negative was worth it, because I just don't think that finding a link about candidate privacy specifically, I just don't think that's possible.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? So the thing about this resolution is the resolution is both really vague and really specific at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's really vague because it says in a democracy, not the United States. So you don't know where it is. And it's really specific because it says, let's look at these two things that very rarely conflict with each other and only examine the conflict.
Yes.
So Sigel, I'm really glad that you brought up like how it is in other countries, because I do think that the closest link that I could find doing my initial research on the topic about security actually seemed relatively substantive. It was from the Harvard International Law Journal about populist candidates and the fitness for public rule. And that's the title of the article, and it came out in August of this year. That is talking about why we need the right to know to understand human rights abuses that populist candidates may have or may want to cover up in emerging democracies. So while this
you know what's funny, Jack? I think I literally actually read that article today.
Yeah.
Or rather, I skimmed it. But I did actually the exact same article that you just said. I found it. I thought the article was like, should human rights abuses be considered disqualification for office?
I apologize. I also only cut the article in one card from the article, and it was that was the articulation of the card. But I think it informs to a larger AF that I think could potentially I don't know. I think maybe fit under this paradigm, maybe not of security in the big stick sense of terrorism, or maybe even small stick or slower violences that could exist through more authoritarian rule or stuff like that, or backsliding.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I mean, populism is definitely one of those sort of, Thomas Jefferson was talking about it, right? About why he didn't like democracy. He was like, oh, populism. So clearly that's going to be a thing on any topic about democracy. So we have this thing, right? This right to know. And as we just sort of, I think, conclusively talked about. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about our observations of, well, actually, we should actually just say what the right to know actually is, right? But here's the thing. As Lindsey said, the right to know in any specific sort of defined definitional sense, maybe obviously you might want to have a definition, but really what it just means is the candidate has some privacy about something, and the public says, we have the right to know about it, or we should be able to get you to tell us what that is. So really what the topic is saying is there is this sort of defined sense, and it's small because candidates don't have rights to privacy about everything, right? But in that list of things that they do have privacy about, the public should say, we have a right to know what some of that privacy thing, and we should be able to uncover that. We should be able to take something that you have a right to privacy to, and then turn that into something that we know now.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that is only for candidates, only for public office, and only in democracies. So let's talk about some of the observations for the topic. And basically what we're going to do here is limit arguments that we think are not topical. Because on this topic, especially on this topic, there's so many arguments that look like they should be topical, but so many, right? And I think the first thing is just to go back to what Lindsey said about the right to know. Your opponents will probably read a bunch of cards because they'll look at the first phrase in the resolution, the right to know, and they'll be like, I'll find cards that this is good, or I'll find cards this is bad. And as Lindsey mentioned, really those are not where you want to be. A lot of them are not about the context of the resolution. They're about right to know versus governments, not individual citizens with like 2 kids trying to become a state senator in Vermont, right? So but the resolution is also, again, just about candidates. We talked about that earlier. Candidates have different sort of sets of privacy expectations than individuals. And now I really want to talk about the right to privacy part of the resolution. Again, this is the most important part of the resolution by a lot. Now, Charles, I'm going to ask you a question about this.
Sure.
So let's say an affirmative made the following argument that, spoiler alert, I believe is not topical.
Okay.
Let's say the affirmative argument is that the public has a right to know about the past sexual misconduct of people, specifically with regards to sexual assault. We have the right to know whether they have sexually assaulted anyone in the past. Or let's say it was to say, we have a right to know about, whether or not this person dealt drugs in the past or was convicted of a drug violation.
Okay.
We have the right to know about all those things. So I believe that those are not topical. And do you think you have a sense of why?
I don't know if this answers your question, but I think that those things would be public anyway, because if those were like criminal charges in the candidate's history, like local jurisdictions would have those on file, like about that candidate under their name. But I think that, so I don't really think that is covered in an individual sense of privacy because it's something that they're being charged with by the government. So that automatically that's different compared to something like medical records, which are inherently personal, but to the point if someone affects the autonomy of another person through things like assault or through dealing drugs, the state is inherently involved in that through like just simple law and order.
Yeah, the legal system,
and
right?
The legal system, right?
So I think that's definitely true, but I also kind of think we can even take it farther than that, right?
Okay.
So of course you don't have if you have a record, right, that's not private. It's literally just sitting there. You wouldn't even need a right to know about that because it's there. So, however, I also think, and this is just my personal view, I also think that even if the legal system was never involved, you still don't have a right to privacy about that.
Right.
Because you in the United States and really everywhere don't have the right to privacy about whether you violated the law.
Right.
Right? So even if they've never discovered whether you violated the law, right? For example, if, let's say, I was in my house or whatever, and the government somehow found out that I was keeping like 10 people locked in my basement, like I just kidnapped them, right? And then the government like comes in there and I'm like, whoa there, right to privacy, right?
Right.
Like you can't do that, right? You can't squirrel out of doing that by just saying, hey, it was in my house, so the fact that I stabbed these 5 people, it's like no. Right. Right. You just don't have a right to privacy about your illegal acts.
Right.
Which again, sort of perversely means that the resolution is not about your past illegal activity, even if it's never discovered. Things like sexual assault, which you would think. right?
Whoa.
Would be topical.
Okay. I see where you're going with that. And I think that's an
Uh-huh.
interesting extrapolation of what the resolution implies.
Yeah, I think so too.
That's interesting. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but interesting observation. Okay.
Yeah, because now here is the really important question, and this is just kind of a thing, and this is kind of just a derivation of what we were talking about before, right? The resolution only pops up. So I think I'll demonstrate this with another example. So Jack, I think that a lot of negative arguments on this topic will be something like this. And spoiler alert, I don't think this is topical. What if the negative said there is this thing that candidates should have privacy rights about, but they don't. And we should protect that because they should have those privacy rights. For example, maybe they currently don't have privacy rights about their past sexual misconduct, but privacy is good, so we should let them have that privacy.
I feel as though those kind of negative positions would kind of make a flaw in just assuming that that someone arbitrarily has the right to know about X factor or Y factor.
Mm-hmm. So my view is that is true, and precisely because the resolution only comes up where you actually have to privacy about the thing, right? Because the resolution says the right to know ought to be valued above this right to privacy you already have. And so the negative just saying you should have a bunch of new rights to privacy, right, isn't really even about the conflict in the resolution. The resolution is basically, in my view, if anyone disagrees, let me know, but my reading of the resolution is like, you have a right to privacy about some stuff, okay? And the public's right to know says, we have to pick one of those cases where you already have a right to privacy and we should reveal that stuff. That if you don't already have the right to privacy about it, then it just isn't a case of the resolution. So the negative could just pick random things that should be private in candidates' lives. It wouldn't really be about the conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my view at least.
No, I would absolutely
just about the trade-off.
Okay. It also seems for certain debaters too. I think it seems like a really good theoretical objection for the 1IR. Types of negative arguments that seem to just randomly choose different caveats to defend.
Yeah, I 100% agree. If the negative is like we should have a right to privacy about stuff, just very much in general, that if their cards are not about the conflict between the things, then I would be highly skeptical of that stuff. And if they just mention things that aren't really about what you have a right to privacy about, then yeah, it just doesn't negate the resolution. All right, so now I want to go to something that we talked about at the very beginning, and I know we've spent a long time talking about what the resolution means before we even have got into the arguments on each side. But I think it's like super important that you all recognize this. So in the United States, it's not in the resolution; it's in a democracy. So let me ask you this question. Let me ask you this question, Charles. So
sure.
The United Kingdom.
Okay.
What are their candidate right to privacy laws?
I'm not aware of the specific laws.
Right, me neither. Lindsey, how about Canada's?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
No idea, right? And that's just that's the thing. I could just give you the name of every democracy that's not in the United States, and you would just say question mark, right?
Yeah.
The only ones I know are Scandinavia because the answer is no, they don't. For example, everyone in Canada has to disclose their tax returns, even random citizens. Everyone has to do that.
Wow.
It's kind of insane. So, oh, by the way, right? Here's the thing: not about candidates at all, but some really stuff that I like. For literally 60 seconds, I was really excited about an affirmative case, and then I realized that it wasn't topical. Because I saw some stuff about how in Scandinavian countries, the fact that every individual has to disclose their tax returns helps eliminate gender pay gaps.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, because it's because now lawyers can't just rely on the sort of code of no one say what you're earning, and people say that is what allows them to hide gender pay gaps because women don't know how much they're making relative to other people, so what they can point out, and males don't know that they're sort of subtly screwing over women as well, and no one can really out the companies. But in those places, it did help to do that because now everyone's stuff is disclosed, so people would obviously raise a big stink about it. And I was really excited for 60 seconds, and then I realized obviously would not apply to candidates at all. You couldn't make an argument about the gender pay gap just in the case of Senate candidates. That's not a thing, right?
Yeah.
Which is such a shame because that would have been an actual like good argument on the topic. I was so excited, but
so close.
so close, yeah, so close. By the way, is really just the sort of subheader for this resolution. So in the United States, not in the resolution. The resolution is in a democracy. That means that I think in a lot of your debates, there's a very compelling argument to be made that you should not talk specifically about specific countries. And
Yeah.
when I'm talking about that, Lindsey, right? What do I mean? What's all of the literature about?
The U.S.
The U.S. Literally 100% of it that I found is about the United States. But the resolution doesn't say that. The resolution says all the democracies, or some hypothetical democracy, as Charles put it, right?
Yes.
And so here's the question, right? So you have the resolution, and what the resolution says is you have a right to privacy and you have a right to know. And only when a right to privacy conflicts with a right to know does the resolution happen. Right? So basically what we said just now was the only time that the resolution comes up is if we know what privacy rights candidates have. Right?
Mhm.
But what privacy rights do candidates have in anywhere but the United States? We have no idea. Right? There's no literature about it. So it's almost impossible to make any very specific empirical claims about that topic. Now, of course, later we're going to, in our positions, we're obviously not just going to throw up our hands and be like, figure it out, right? We're going to let you know what we found about the United States. But I do just want to emphasize that if ever there was a topic for you all to just like not debate at all about empirics, right? To just like only debate about philosophical issues, I think this is the one. Because you have a really compelling argument that the resolution is basically meaningless when it comes to empirical facts.
That's true. Yeah.
Because, right, you would love to say, oh, so here's an example of where the right to privacy conflicts with the right to know, and therefore, in this case, we should value one over the other. And then I am a huge advocate in every cross-ex, in any round that you're in, of just being like, give me an example of one country and what their rights to privacy are for their candidates that aren't the United States. And I just don't think they'll ever give you an answer. And then you basically just won the debate immediately.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
And for a lot of judges, I mean, Jack can obviously attest to this, right? For a lot of judges, I mean, obviously Lindsey and Charles too, because you both debated in Florida, you know what it's like. Which is to say that a lot of these rounds are won and lost in cross-ex.
I agree.
And
Yes.
And if you just like do that in cross-ex and your opponent's just like, I have no clue, I think you almost just win.
Yeah.
I agree. Plus, the judge would be skeptical of like anything that they're saying after that.
Yeah.
It
And then
would
they're
be
like-
definitely an uphill battle after that.
So
Yeah, and they're like, but my evidence about the United States, and then you're just like, but the resolution doesn't say that. It says in a democracy, and they're like, well, the United States is a democracy. I mean, I can exactly predict how this conversation is going to go.
How would that debate play out actually? Because I feel I'll defend that I think that the United States is a great example and is fine. Right, you can say that fundamentally we were one of the most progressed democracies, an example of a late stage democracy in the context of like capitalism or context of like modern globalization. Why not use the United States as the primary like fundamental example?
I do want to engage with what you said, but I also just want to just like note just the length of time that it took you to talk about capitalism.
Oh, sorry.
It's like a very specific view. So 17 minutes. But anyway, to engage with what you said, I think that the resolution obviously affects the United States, and I think the affirmative, of course, has a right to talk about it. But I do think that skewering your opponent in cross-ex for it is definitely a good idea. And of course, but if you're the one get on the end of the skewer, right? You should take Jack's approach of being like, hey, I do think this is a representative example of the way that democracies work. And the fact that there's a lot of literature about it kind of proves that this is the place where the debate's really playing out. And it's true that it's democracies generally, but I do still think that just like the shock value of just being like, can you just give me one other one? Just like literally any democracy. I'll settle for any democracy. And they still won't be able to do it because there are no articles about it at all. Okay, so before we go into so again, I just want to give a big overview thing, and then you all can sort of chip in with your own individual overviews about how to debate the topic. We spent a lot of time talking about it, and our basic view is that this topic is, again, both somehow really broad and really narrow. It's really broad because the literature is about the United States, but the topic is theoretically unbounded to include every democracy. So in that sense, it's vague, but it's also really specific. The resolution only comes up where a candidate has a right to privacy, and there is some argument for that to be undermined via disclosure or something like that. And that sort of narrow question within the broad question of the countries is, I think, what this debate will really be about. And it's only about candidates and not about government officials or anything like that.
Okay.
Okay, so do you all have anything to add, or do you think we're good to go into the positions?
I think we're good.
I think we're good, yeah.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, so when we return, we'll talk about the positions for affirmative on this resolution. So welcome to the section. We're going to talk about 3 affirmative arguments, and we're going then, in the next section, going to talk about 3 negative arguments. Important thing to clarify, what we're going to do is we're going to go over every affirmative argument, or like 3 of them, and then every negative argument. And then what we'll do is we'll say, so first we're going to say, what's the argument? How does it work? Then we're going to say, how do you write the argument? How would you put the argument together in a debate, which includes criterions and research and things like that. Then, for each of our arguments, we're going to give 2 objections to that argument that you all can introduce in debate, so that we're presenting you holistically with a picture of the argument, and then how you would put it together, and then also how you would beat it if your opponent made the argument. All right, so let's talk. So we've labeled this a first affirmative position, democracy, which obviously should strike you as weird because democracy is just a word in the resolution, right? So how is this argument topical? Now, this argument goes by a lot of names. It goes by democratic ideals, democratic procedures or proceduralism, and things like that. So Jack, can you just sort of maybe walk us through this argument in general? What is the position about democratic ideals and democratic proceduralism before you even get necessarily into the resolution itself? Just like if you hear like democratic ideals, democratic proceduralism, what is that case usually about?
Yeah, that case is usually about describing some sort of conditions or some sort of way that democracy should be structured, and kind of allows it to using that mechanism to affirm the resolution. So someone would say that they think that being able to understand completely about the candidate is fundamental to a democracy for a certain number of reasons.
Yeah, right. So you have arguments now. So Lindsey, if you hear like democratic ideals in general, right? Now those are kinds of the things that democracy strives to do. Now those ideals aren't the exact same ideals for everything else, right? Now obviously there's some overlap, right?
What do you mean?
But there is some difference. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
What do you mean for everything else?
So for example, like the ideals that I hold as a person, right?
Okay.
Like maybe I want happiness, for example. And so democratic ideals, some of those things are some of the same ideals that individuals have, but some of them are kind of unique to democracies, or ones that democracies should care about maybe like a little more than they care about other things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so do you have a sense of maybe like what some of those things are? Well, the way that I basically think about it normally is like, democracies, what makes them different from non-democracies or as a style of government? What information does it really tell us? Because when we were talking about democracies before, right?
Yeah.
A democracy, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so like democratic ideals, like kind of by the people for the people, that the citizens are the ones kind of directing how government should be and how it should operate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, keep going.
Well, I guess that's like really it. I'm still kind of confused as to what you mean on like in regards to everything else.
Yeah. Just that is like basically what I meant.
Okay.
Which is to say that like when you're in a democracy, the basic idea is that like in a democracy, certain kinds of things are just more important than other things that you would maybe care about that you wouldn't care about otherwise, or you'd care about more. And I think the thing that Lindsey said, right, which is the relationship between the government and the people, that's really the key part of all of this, right? What makes a democracy different? I mean, what makes it different is that the people really have a say.
Mhm.
And so when people talk about democratic ideals, normally they mean something along those lines, that people should have a say, and that in democracy, people should really strive to make sure that people have a say. So that is democratic ideals. And I've also labeled this democratic proceduralism. And what I mean by that is that in order to achieve democratic ideals, it's not just enough to just sort of like hope, right? Democracy has certain things, certain ways that it helps achieve its ideals. One of those ways, for example, is voting. Democratic ideals obviously involves things like participation and the relationship between the citizen and the government. And voting helps to sort of achieve that, where people go out and vote, and that kind of proves their influence. But there are also just other procedures, things that are important, like sort of like public input. And one of the main things, so I've kind of, for this topic, I've really identified two main procedures that I think are important. And I think you all have a pretty good sense of what they are. So Charles, can you just go over to just one of those? So on this topic,
Right.
your argument should be that democratic ideals are important, and we have to have some way of achieving those. And this topic really intersects with a couple of those. And what do you think is one of those things?
I think one of them is an informed electorate.
Mhm.
So the idea that the people who are voting for candidates for public office not only know about like when you I remember a few PF topics from a few years ago that talked a lot about the U.S. elections, and in that context, the quote unquote educated voter was a voter who was familiar with the policies and such that candidates were advocating for during the campaigns. But I think in this context, it's more of the educated voter in the context of knowing who you are voting for and what they stand for and what their histories are like. So I think that is a key pillar to democracy, because without having an educated electorate, then there's really no point of having democracy in the first place. Because if you just have people voting ignorantly, then what are they really voting for?
Yeah, exactly. Now, Jack, can you maybe put this in the context of like democratic ideals? Because remember, and like I 100% agree with Charles. Like that's the number one that I thought of, right? And I think it really does apply. But in terms of democratic ideals, why might it really hinder a democracy that people just didn't know what was going on? Like, because like, what's the point of voting, right? This is kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it seems like voting in a democracy relies on some sort of flow of information or some sort of, ability to be able to know about your decision making and have informed decisions. It seems to be fundamental to a democracy.
Yeah, because the idea is that citizens have influence and are able to choose the candidates that best reflect their preferences. That's kind of the whole part of the whole point of voting, if you kind of put it into an economics sort of thing, right?
Yeah,
Is that voting? Sorry, what?
It's rational decision calculus. You're trying to decide on which outcome would best suit your individual situation.
Yeah, and the point is that you can't do that if you don't know anything about a candidate. If, for example, you're just voting for literally, you just get to the ballot box and it's like candidate X, candidate Y. You know nothing about them, right? And the idea is just like, it's not democracy if you just pick one at random, right? Because you just could never. I mean, let's say you even tried to figure it out and you just couldn't. It's just like very sort of a farcical situation, and that sort of removes one of the key parts of democracy, which is the whole point of democracy is that citizens can express their preference for what they want in office. And the lack of a public right to know about stuff really can hurt that, because we don't know things about them, specifically about things about their past that we might really want to know about. And that sort of prevents us from having an informed citizenry such that they can really vote for the candidate. Because remember, this whole topic is about elections. It's about candidates. So for those candidates, that really is the most things that we should know. We should know the stuff they've done. And if we can't, how can it really be a democracy? Now, there was another argument that I came up with in the literature. So did any of you all read the Streifer article? It was the article about medical privacy and consent. Did you all read that one?
I think I skimmed it.
I don't think I've seen it.
It sounds familiar, but I can't say I remember.
So that argument made, I think, the other really good argument for sort of a democratic ideals kind of case. And Charles, do you remember just what was the gist of the argument?
No, I'm trying to think if this
If
was
you,
the same article. What was the argument specifically?
the argument was that if is that if you don't know the candidate's like stuff about the candidate, then you really haven't given democratic consent for them to be in office.
Okay, interesting. So you're
So
not educated enough to vote for them?
well, so here's the thing. It's a slightly different argument than the educated voter, even though they're sort of both about the same. I think they isolate different harms about democracy. So the first one says that if you just aren't an educated voter, then you haven't really expressed your preferences, and that's very undemocratic because you just create a situation where no one knows who they're voting for. But then there's also kind of the consent component of that. And there's sort of two sides of the same coin, which is to
Right.
say that if someone gets into office and you think you know them, but you actually don't, that they were just like hiding a bunch of
Okay.
stuff from you, then
Okay.
then they do not have your consent to be in office, really,
Right. Okay.
because you voted for somebody else.
Yeah, I actually found the cards that I cut from it, and one of the lines is, quote, "There are numerous democratic principles that underwrite the right to vote,
Yeah.
that those who govern should do so with the consent of the governed." Right. Okay, I see
Yeah.
what you're saying now.
That
Yeah.
article, by the way, is very nice. Can you just
Yes.
read out the name of the authors real quick
Yes.
so that the people can listen to that?
Yes. So the names are Robert Streifer, which is Streifer, and Alan P. Rubel, Rubel, and the final author is Julie R. Fagan, Fagan. It's from 2006, and the title is Medical Privacy and the Public's Right to Vote: What Presidential Candidates Should Disclose.
Yeah, I think that article was very nice, and I think it makes a very compelling argument for
Yeah,
democracy.
I agree. Yeah.
Of course, we're about to undermine it in a second. But okay, so how would you put this together is what we're going to talk about next. And again, we're going to talk about criterions as well as some research tips. So, Lindsey, I don't necessarily think that this is rocket science. What criterions would you have for a case about democratic ideals?
I would probably just say like upholding democratic ideals.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, you really should just cut to the chase. I mean, don't try and make it more complicated than it is.
Yeah, like upholding the principles of democracy. I think it's just a question of wording.
Yeah, it's basically just wording.
Yeah.
You could say democratic proceduralism. That kind of just sounds a little worse, but it's basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Democratic ideals, upholding, promoting, respecting, whatever, right? Just whatever verb you want. Okay, so how do you research it? We just gave you a good article by Streifer from 2006 about what medical records and what candidates should disclose and consent and stuff like that. If you look up all those words, you'll get it. And as also just how you research this in general, I really think that a bunch of the generic articles are about this. A lot of them are in the context of the medical part of a topic that we'll talk about in a bit. But yeah, just finding stuff generally. Again, you don't really look for this by looking for the right to know. You look for especially stuff about medical and how that intersects with voting and democracy and stuff like that. And a lot of the articles, especially on regular Google, will make this argument. Did you have something to say, Lindsey?
Oh no, I really agree on the whole, like in regards to researching right to know, not just researching the right to know period, because then it'll just relate to a bunch of irrelevant security arguments.
Yeah, I will say that again, there are right to know arguments about this, but they're just dwarfed, right,
yes,
by the quantity of arguments that are not. Okay.
I think a good way for people to delineate, or debaters to delineate, when debating someone, who's maybe using evidence just about the right to know in general in terms of governments, is looking for things like FISA courts, or people talking about those specific government instances or government institutions that would only apply in these types of situations absent a candidate.
Yeah, 100% agree. And actually, this would be a really good time to talk about that. I'm really glad you brought that up. So let's talk about some things that should tip you off that your opponent's evidence is really about government secrecy. Number one is if it says the word government, obviously. Number two is if it talks about secrecy, right? People like when someone's like, I don't want to tell you my medical history, that's not secrecy, right?
That's just like medical confidentiality.
Yeah, it's not like, ooh, what a secretive guy. He doesn't want to tell us like, what medication he's on. It's like it's not what it's about, right? So that should be a big hint if it's about secrecy. Again, if it mentions specific things, as Jack said, like FISA courts, things that should really not apply. If it talks too much about transparency, then it's almost certainly not topical. Here's another good one. If it talks about freedom of information laws.
Oh yeah.
Because that was a really big part of government secrecy topic, was whether freedom of information laws were good. And that was why I loved researching the topic, because there was actually a ton of research that freedom of information laws were good, and a ton of research that it was bad, and it was really interesting. And none of that's topical. Okay, so now let's go into how you answer the argument. So we have in our document, we have someone has written out an argument against this. So who wrote that, and can they explain it?
Yes, I wrote it. So I think that a kind of a key argument to kind of counter this kind of claim just about knowledge is focusing on the right to privacy as something that's fundamental to someone who is in a democracy, in order to be able to make sure that they have control over information about themselves that they may not necessarily want to be public. The way that's a good way, I think, to theoretically about this, but I think an example you could use empirically would be the way that we potentially use past like sexual histories of female candidates, and we over extrapolate or over pursue maybe their like those like intimate details about like maybe their text messages or stuff like that. Obviously, I think there's contestations with that type of argument, but I think it still demonstrates an example of how maybe the right to privacy should be protected in a specific instance.
Yeah, and like one way of thinking about this as well is, and this kind of transitions into the second argument that we have, but it's basically also just like, oh, we need an informed voter, right? Does that mean we need to know whether you had a checkup when you were 19?
Yeah,
it's like at a certain point, right? The educated voter stuff really goes too far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now also what we have here is a thing about individual rights being key to protecting democracy, and I really like this argument that you were kind of getting at as well, because it's like, you know what's also a democratic ideal, like making sure that the people's rights are respected.
Yeah,
because they're kind of the fundamental unit, right, of this whole democratic thing, is that you have individuals who get to decide on governments, and so individuals are kind of important. So therefore, we shouldn't just like, disregard them whenever we want.
I agree.
Yeah, and obviously you could answer that argument fairly easily, but that's pretty good. Now, the second argument that I have here. Now, who wrote this one, and can they talk about it?
I also wrote this one.
Okay.
Just because I really just was focusing.
Gung ho, you're gung ho. I'm ready. We're ready.
Yeah. So I think this is an argument that could be used against funding. Someone who says that we maybe find better candidates if there is a right to know, and maybe we have better democratic procedures. Saying that this might overload the amount of information about a candidate, where you could overlook maybe major policy decisions or maybe actual things that would affect, or bigger issues that could affect their candidacy. An example empirically, I think, is when people, I remember when Rachel Maddow came forward with Trump's tax returns. She made a huge deal of it, even though it was like 2 pages and like didn't reveal much information. And it seemed to distract from the real policy decisions that Trump was making at the time, where people, it seemed like the Democratic base was so rallied up about this one very fairly insignificant issue that could, they overlooked a lot of other bad problems that were occurring.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think this is a pretty great argument on this topic, and I think we'll get into it very deeply when we get into one of the negative arguments especially. But so I think that one really good argument that just goes along with that, I mean, I think that's a really perfect example, but it's like, It's like so Lindsey, right? What is your like opinion of the app? So again, a lot of us are from Florida, right? So
Yeah.
what is your opinion of like the thing that the average Florida voter would really like care about? I mean, like obviously they like care about the economy, but like when people like talk about stuff, what do they like tend to focus on? Is it like, wow, look at these policy issues?
I feel like you're insinuating it's something that I'm not grasping what you mean.
Yeah, I'm just like pretty sure. I'm just pretty sure that that on a lot of that like a lot of voters are just very easily distracted by irrelevant information.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would agree with that.
Just like a bunch of random social information.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or things like, Obama was born in Kenya or whatever. Like
Yeah.
just think about how much press time that got versus like, hey, should we drone strike this person or not,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that example is stacked in the wrong way and really not exactly the comparison. But like the point is that maybe the public wants to know it, right? And maybe it would be better if the public had it, but maybe it also won't. Maybe it won't be better. Maybe instead they'll just focus on that and not what the candidate's standing for. Maybe the candidate is sitting there saying things like, I think free trade is good and we should promote free trade. And they're like, yeah, but this says that you got a broken arm when you were 15 and it like never fully healed, so we're not going to vote for you.
Yeah. A bunch of just like irrelevant information. I feel like a lot of it's just red herrings to
Exactly.
drive away from the issue.
In fact, I hadn't thought about that word, but I really think you all should use that word. We just had a kind of logical fallacies episode a couple episodes ago. That's literally what it is. It just gives them a bunch of red herrings.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think there's really a lot of ways you can answer this argument, but I also think, by the way, just my personal opinion, is that this argument is very good. And the reason that I think it's good is that it is consistent with the vagueness of the resolution if you want to go that route, right? You don't have to go about, hey, this is United States specific. You can really just be like, I just think that candidates should have to tell us stuff in general. And I think that they should tell us things and it shouldn't always be what's private because of democracy and whatever. So I do think you should expect to hear this case a lot, and I would definitely be prepared to debate against it. All right, so let's talk about the second affirmative argument. So I have this listed as tax returns. Now, Charles, what is your impression of this argument and how it would work? Just starting very generally from the top. Well, actually, let me ask you this question. So I asked my debaters this question, and they were like, "Oh, I actually don't know. What's a tax return?"
A tax return is I believe, a statement that you get from the IRS that no, wait. A tax return is the sum of money that you get back from the IRS after you file your taxes, and the tax return, I think, that we refer to in our election cycle, is the importance of it is that you have different like things that you write off your taxes for. For example, like you might have like donations or something that you get tax I forget the specific word, but it's like pretty much cuts to your taxes because you give to like philanthropic causes. I think that's the technical definition of what it is, right? But I think we understand it now as kind of like where we spend our money and where we get our money.
Yeah, I think everyone has a pretty vague understanding of what this is. Well, not everyone. I mean, obviously, there are people who know what tax returns are, right? But from the perspective of the debate, it's pretty much just like how you spend your money.
Right.
But so Jack, do you want to echo what Charles said in terms of a tax return?
Yes, I definitely agree. I think that the biggest implication that kind of tax returns have, again, are like where sources of incomes are, and where
and assets.
Yeah, and assets. And so this is also relating to potentially with candidates who have connections to foreign countries or might have assets in foreign countries or other countries, or maybe with corporations that might not be exactly disclosed or public information.
Yeah, so and to go with what Charles said about charity, people make a lot of claims. They're like, hey, I gave $10 bazillion to charity, right? And it's like, well, and then everyone's like, wow, what a great person you are. And then a tax return would, of course, verify whether or not you did that, etc. So, here's the question. Now, a lot of articles on this topic are written in the context of tax returns. And the argument, and so the reason that this is topical, and the reason we're telling you about it, is that you do have a right to privacy about your tax returns. That's pretty much uncontroversial, that you do have a right to privacy about your tax returns. And therefore that the affirmative would override that by suggesting that you should be forced to tell us your tax returns, etc. But let me ask you all this question. So Jack, in terms of disclosure of tax returns, now it is true that you do have a right to not disclose your tax returns. How many public officials have not disclosed their tax returns voluntarily? Because most of them have, right?
Actually, from my understanding, it's that it's not a it's like when asked or when it's become a question, it is a norm that politicians will disclose. So I would say yes, you are right about that consensus. However, I don't think that most politicians, at least on the local level, will just release their returns without a question, some sort of public inquiry into their source of income.
Right. So people don't just like automatically disclose.
Yes, it's not presumed to disclose, but there is a presumption. It's not presumed to disclose, but there's a presumption to say yes if asked.
Yes. Now, yes, that's 100% true. Now, Lindsey, do you know about the statistics about so what I have a very rough but very sort of definitive understanding of the statistics behind who discloses when asked and who doesn't in terms of percentages. So based on your understanding, how do those numbers shake out? So when asked to disclose their tax returns, what is the percentage of people that do it versus what is the percentage of people that don't?
Honestly, I'm not entirely sure on the percentages. I was just more aware of like the norm that Jack was talking about, where like if asked they would disclose. I also think too, like in regards to the presidential candidates, like last year, like Hillary Clinton and Trump, when it became an issue about the tax returns, that was when like Hillary started disclosing stuff, and then people were pressuring Trump too. But I'm not entirely sure on like the specific statistics.
Yeah. So the thing is, I've never looked up a statistic about this, but I'm pretty sure that it's 99.999% of candidates.
Interesting.
Where literally the 0.00001 candidate is Trump.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So
I believe
everyone already discloses. I just don't.
At least when asked. At least I believe that in presidential elections, Trump is the only one to have not done it.
See, I agree with you there. Is that so? Yes, for presidential, because I think an inquiry already exists. But when I was speaking, I think I was speaking more holistically. That in terms of local elections, absolutely for presidential. But that's only one subset of the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, so Martin, just out of curiosity, when you say when asked, what does that entail? Because obviously it's not required for them to do so. So who's the authority that is quote unquote asking? The public?
It would be the public, and they would kind of go to the government and do that, or they would be sued or something.
Yeah.
And or they would use some. I mean, the thing is, I don't know exactly what legal mechanism it would be. It's not quite a Freedom of Information Act request because they're not the government. At least not always. Right. So, but my impression is that people disclose when asked, when the public is like, we would like you to know, or maybe Congress asks sometimes, but usually Congress is just acting as a vehicle for the public. Sometimes it's not. Sure. Sometimes Congress is just like, the public does need to know your thing, so disclose it. And my understanding is that the resolution would only come up if the Congress said, disclose it, the person said no, and then Congress said, here's a law that you have to. Anyways. Or we'll send you to jail or whatever, right? And so the thing is, if the Congress is like, please disclose, and then Hillary Clinton is like, sure, right? I just don't think that's the topic. Now, Jack, I understand your concern. I don't quite know about the local level. I also don't know what their rights to privacy are, and also don't know whether the public's right to know has ever been invoked against one of those candidates.
See, and I think that there probably are like smaller examples. Yeah. Where, but I don't know. But it may be an interesting topic area for debaters to research, because local elections really do affect day-to-day life of a lot of people, and can really affect things like property taxes, for example, and it can affect welfare programs and how those programs are distributed. So that might be something that could be interesting.
To
look into.
Yeah, for sure. But again, so the reason again, this is definitely topical, but also still narrow because most people do disclose their tax returns anyway. Um, and the resolution would only really come about if we had to make them disclose them, which again applies to very few people. To my understanding, it's in presidential elections, it's just Donald Trump, and it might be true for other people as well, but not quite as sure about that. So that's my understanding of the argument. There are a lot of articles in the context of this. There are plenty of advantages. A lot of them are related to what Charles was talking about. How good of a person are you actually? Some of this stuff can even go in with the democracy stuff we were talking about earlier, about how we should know how good of a person you are. We should know whether or not you're lying about some stuff. We should know how you spend your time. We should know how you spend your money. I want to spend some time, though, talking about campaign finance. Now, this was something that we talked about before the podcast, and I just kind of want to give my spiel about it, and then you all can sort of jump in. So at the beginning of the topic, well, okay. So Lindsey, Charles, Jack, we were all talking before this podcast, and basically I told you all individually, and we all were under the impression at the beginning of the topic that campaign finance laws, aka the arguments about disclosing your donors, who gave money to your campaign versus who, we all thought, and we thought that was the intention of the resolution, and maybe it was to talk about that issue, right, guys?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so I was pretty sure that that's what it was about. And then I did some research, and then I figured out that it turns out that even though that looks like the topic and smells like the topic, it's not the topic, right? And that's because the resolution says the right to privacy of candidates for public office. And therefore, it's not just everyone's right to privacy in the situation. It's specifically, what does the candidate have a right to privacy about? And it turns out that the right to privacy in the American legal system is actually the donors. The donors have that right because they spent money. Money is a form of speech, and that form of speech can be anonymous political speech should they so choose. So that has been ruled by American courts to be, there's a privacy right, but it's not the candidates. Or maybe even if it is the candidates, the resolution isn't about that. Because if you did the resolution, let's say, as a principle, you said, okay, now the right to privacy of presidential candidates is less than the public's right to know about campaign finance laws. It turns out that wouldn't do anything because you still haven't undermined the right to privacy of the donors. So even if you have a right to know versus the candidate's right to privacy, you still don't end up subverting campaign finance laws.
Right.
And again, I think your opponents will definitely make this argument, and I think you should really go after them. And I honestly think it is really important for this question that you find a card to answer it. Find a card, and we did, right? Find a card that says the right to privacy is the donors. And by the way, that's what their cards will say too, because the right to, in the maybe parts and on the underlined parts they didn't read or something like that. Or if the author is talking vaguely about, hey, campaign finance laws really intersect with privacy, then you look for their evidence and just ask whose privacy,
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, that's my thought, and I think that people will say that, but it's not really really topical. So in terms of how you write this argument, let's start with the research. I think this argument's fairly easy to research, right, guys? I mean, there's really a lot of news articles about this, especially, right?
Right.
There are some journal articles about it, but not much. Do you?
Yeah.
So I know Lindsey and Charles, you all were researching the topic recently. Would you agree with that assessment? There's some journal articles, but really not that many.
Yeah,
I think
that it's more news articles.
That's
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
And especially a lot of articles written when Trump said, hey, I don't want to disclose my tax returns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of them are specific to him. I think the majority of the ones that I saw, honestly, were specific to Trump.
Right. And even if they aren't, they were definitely written right after, right?
Yes.
That was at least why the article was written in the first place, which is why a lot of them, and by the way, that is kind of an advantage. Your evidence is recent.
Yeah.
Evidence and popular.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
As far as criterions, I think you could go any number of ways with this, right? If it depends on what your arguments in favor of disclosing tax returns are. If, for example, you could make the argument that we should be able to know how good the president is, either because that's important for your, sort of informed voting, which would kind of be a hybrid of this and the earlier position. You could also say that we need to know how much of a good person they are for something like Aristotelian virtue ethics. You would want to say
Right.
something like, it's important that we encourage people to develop good characters, and people should have to say how good of a person they are so that we can sort of, I don't know, like punish them or help them onto the right path, kind of like coerce them a little bit through the ballot into being good. It's like
Right.
you want to be a politician, like you better like not lie about your massive offshore assets.
Right.
And it could be utilitarian as well, right? Your argument could just be that disclosing tax returns is somehow has beneficial effects. There are articles out there that say that as well.
Yeah.
All right, so in terms of how you answer this argument, so there are just as many. So I'm going to go into the first argument, and then one of my lovely guests will give me the second one. So one of the arguments that you can make is just sort of a variation of the normal negative argument about privacy being good, which is, again, most of the negative arguments. So your argument should be, hey, this tax return stuff, it is really public, and it should stay public, because these are public decisions about how you spend money, how you spend time. You shouldn't be, obligated to disclose everything to the public. That is an unreasonable burden. It's an unreasonable expectation. Sure, a lot of people do it voluntarily anyway, right? But that should be your choice about whether you disclose the tax returns. So this will intersect with kind of the individual rights part of the topic. That is a private thing. It has a right to privacy for a reason, and people should not have to disclose that sort of thing. So
Right.
I think that that's an argument, and that argument intersects with this kind of at the criterion level as well, right? That you can say, just because it would be slightly better for you to tell me every bit of money you have everywhere, right? Then that argument, then it still wouldn't be good. We should still have right to privacy about some things, and that's an important thing that we should have right to privacy about, and it should be personal. I think
Right.
that's
Okay.
one of the main arguments.
Okay.
So does someone have the second, or can someone go for the second argument for me?
I kind of have an idea.
Yeah, go for it.
I think that I don't really know how this argument would interact with affirmatives, but it seems to me that the affirmatives would be making a claim that the candidates have to be the ones who release it because of their privacy shouldn't be valued over the public's right to know. So I think that one argument that I've gathered from like the news cycle after the 2016 election is that if something is there in the tax returns that is very important, there will be other outlets such as WikiLeaks, such as anonymous reporters that will make sure that those arguments get to the public anyway. For example, when in the 2016 election, or I don't know, I guess this was after the election, the dossier that was accusing Trump of a bunch of different things, or like the Panama Papers, like those were both examples of things that implicated Trump's tax returns. So even though his tax returns proper weren't in the public sphere, there was still information that allowed people to make their own judgments about what were in those tax returns. So I don't really know if that negates, because it's still technically their privacy being their privacy is being violated, I guess. But it's just kind of an argument that says like we don't have to affirm and value this over that because it will come up no matter what, and it's inevitable. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely think it does, right? You can just make the argument that affirming really is trying to address a quote-unquote problem. And of course, your argument really is that it's not a problem. But even if it was a problem, it's a problem that is just fixed almost by doing nothing.
Right? Exactly.
It's
just,
so
we don't have to call into question the ethical conflict that the resolution asks for. If we just let it be, then it'll solve itself, because people out there that know the secrets behind the tax returns or financial records will make sure that they're public if they think that they're important enough.
Yeah. And I do think that those two arguments that we mentioned, the first argument about how it would sort of that there is an important ethical issue with regard to your privacy rights, and the second argument about how a lot of it's going to get disclosed anyways. Right. I do think there is a little bit of tension between those. So just be a little careful, right? Because of course, if your point is just that, eventually all your information is going to be on some government website, then it's kind of hard to really stick to your guns and argue that things that should really be private.
Sure.
Yep. However, but again, there's some counterplay to that argument as well. I mean, tax returns aren't the end all be all. They don't reveal much, but a lot of what they do reveal is public information.
Right.
And again, I think one of the main points here is it might be good for something like Virtue for people to release tax returns, but it's not necessarily good to force them to release tax returns. And another thing, right? And this is just all going to Charles' point that doing the affirmative really is not necessary. People disclose their tax returns anyway. I mean, they really do. So even though this is an area where there's a lot of literature about in terms of and again, you should look it up because there's a bunch of it about why people should do this thing. A lot of it is sort of solved by the status quo.
Right.
But we need to get into the next argument for reasons of time. So let's get into the third argument. This argument was medical records. Now, when you all started researching the topic, do you think this would be 55% of the topic literature? Because I definitely did not.
I thought it was going to be maybe 20%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say maybe 20 to 30%.
Like a fourth of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it would be some niche area.
Yeah,
right?
I thought it was going to be like something to take opponents off guard with.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was going to be so cliche.
That's what I thought too. And then I just searched the generic resolution and saw all these articles about medical. And I was like, oh, it's actually the entire topic.
That was a plot twist for me.
Yeah, for sure. This topic had a lot of plot twists. In terms of finding out all of a sudden that there are a lot of arguments that you thought you could make, and then the topic was you looked at it, you're I have no idea what this means. This topic has 6 prepositional phrases, and then you're oh, now I think I get what the topic's about. And then you do research and you're wait, none of that's topical.
Yeah, you're all 4 of those apps that I thought just not gonna work.
Yeah, and then it turns out that this one niche area that I thought was a small affirmative is the entirety of the topic literature plus tax returns. Speaking of niche area, medical records. So, Lindsey, can you just describe the argument here overall?
Yeah, so this argument is advocating that candidates disclose just medical records generally. I feel like it would either be one of 2 things. Either one, just their physical health, since a lot of presidential candidates are old, so it's a question of if they'll die in office, if something bad with their health is going to be an issue in regards to them fulfilling their duties. The second.
Yeah. So sorry to just interrupt you before getting into that second point. So in particular, for some reason, a bunch of people writing about this topic are obsessed with one component of that, one physical disease injury thing that for some reason there's multiple different articles about in terms of physical health. Did you get a sense of what that was?
I don't think.
I just saw a lot of articles about heart disease specifically.
Okay.
Right. And again, a lot of articles, quote unquote, right? too, right? But that are what's the president's risk of heart disease, right? Is he going to die in office? How's his lungs and how's his heart, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt. Continue.
No, it's okay. And I found a lot of arguments too, kind of being this is not unique. Our people in the past have kind of planned for presidents to die in office, but it also hasn't been that major of a problem with presidents dying in office. But then the other argument is them disclosing things regarding their mental health. So if they've ever been institutionalized, if they have ever sought treatment for depression, substance abuse, anything along those lines, that it would be the public's right to know because it would regard their ability to perform well in office. And I'm pretty sure it was the Eagleton case where he wasn't necessarily a public office candidate that one would vote for directly, but he was going to be appointed
vice president. Yeah.
And he ended up being taken off the ballot just because of all the backlash that the candidate got for president, even though he didn't actually win the election. He still got a lot of backlash for it and removed him from the ticket.
Yeah, that's the thing about doing debate. All of a sudden, you just read a bunch of articles, and now you just know random politicians' names who lost elections in the 70s.
Exactly.
It's just oh yes, this guy who was a vice presidential candidate, Thomas Eagleton, of someone whose name I know now, George McGovern, who is running against them is running against, I don't know who it was, maybe Reagan in 72 or something,
Yeah.
or Nixon, one of those goons.
I think
right?
it was Nixon. I think it was Nixon.
Yeah, I think Reagan was the actual 80s. So yeah, Nixon so yeah, it was like this guy was just, and see, the thing is, looking at it from our modern day perspective, we're just kind of like, ugh, was that really a reason why someone got taken off the ballot?
Yeah.
They were treated for depression. I mean, these days we're really trying to normalize that. And well, so maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about negative arguments in a bit, right?
Yeah, but originally too, McGovern was like, oh yeah, no, even though like this information has been disclosed that he has seek treatment for depression, I'm still going to stand by him no matter what. And shortly thereafter, he was just like, nah, like leave. So
yeah, he kind of got ran out of town. Now,
yeah.
as far as just like the persuasive footing for this argument, I do think that it has some appeal, right? You can say that, like, ultimately, I mean, even viewed from a democracy perspective, right? That article, the Stryfer article that Charles gave out earlier, right? That article was about medical records, and the argument is that when you are voting, you should know who you're voting for in terms of the likelihood that they're going to stick around. Now, I think some of the things maybe you don't want to go. Like one of the things people were saying back in like 72 was like, what if he gets depressed and like nukes the Russians, right? And I really don't think that that's at all reasonable of a thought, right? And I think if you said that in a debate, you should really like, get laughed out of the room. But ultimately, right, it is kind of, you can really imagine this as a potential serious issue where in terms of democracy or in terms of fitness for office, which is what people talk about a lot, like, how quote unquote qualified is this person for office? And I think part of that is also like, how's their health? How's their stamina? Can they keep it up? Being a president is hard, right? Should you, how at least the public might be able to want to know whether or not what the answers to those questions are. But anyway, so I think there are a lot of well-written articles about this topic, is what I will say. And I do think that this is where a lot of the affirmative literature lives. The tax return stuff is pretty complicated, and a lot of it kind of affirms, but still, the medical record stuff really is most interesting. Now, again, in terms of medical records, I really want to stress what Lindsey was talking about. It's both physical, quote unquote physical, and quote unquote mental fitness. Which is to say, like, did you have a depression checkup when you were 19, right? Were you ever on antidepressants, right? Things like that, are covered by this issue. And also, just like, what medications are you on? Have you seek treatment for this random illness? I mean, medical records, by the way, are a part of the topic because they're incredibly private, right? I mean, you do really have privacy rights about those things. Those are actual intimate details of your personal life. But still, the affirmative says, yes, you have a right to privacy about that, but sometimes the public should have a right to know. When you're balancing those things, you really should let us know. In the interest of time, let's move on to talk about how you would write the position. Again, for criterions, I want to say the same thing that I said for tax returns, which is it can be a lot of things. It can be democracy. But I think this might be where a utilitarian argument really comes into play, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Martin.
Yeah, where it's like, hey, maybe we want people who are good at making decisions or something, and maybe if your decision making is potentially compromised, the public should know about that and be able to kind of check against that. And then if someone, as the Stryfer article says, if you vote for someone and then later find out that they're really not fit for office, then maybe you wouldn't have voted for them, etc. And maybe you shouldn't. In terms of how you research it, this one is, there are Google Scholar articles about this topic and JSTOR articles, but again, a lot of it's Google. But again, there are academic articles about the topic, but regular Google is really where you want to be. Okay, so Lindsey,
Yeah.
don't worry, Jack. I'll get to you eventually. So Lindsey, I have one of our negative arguments is an argument about discrimination, and we'll sort of talk about it there. But can you just explain how that argument that we'll eventually explain applies just exactly to the medical records argument? Like, it's literally about that. So.
Yeah. So do you want me to explain like just the argument and then how it applies, or?
Yeah, just the argument really fast because we're going to get into it later.
Yeah. So the argument is basically that disclosing like medical records, pretty much of any nature, but I would say more specifically mental illness, that it's bad because it stigmatizes disabled individuals, and like that stigmatization shouldn't like follow somebody to office for XYZ reasons. There are a lot of different ways that you can impact that out. But yeah, that's just the general argument. But it directly responds to the medical records argument, because the medical records argument is like advocating for disclosure of some type of like previous health or medical record. The ableism argument says that no, that's bad because it leads to discrimination of XYZ people.
Yep, that's perfect. So yes, and it does exactly apply. Now, again, I think the second argument is kind of more along the lines of what I said before. Now, I've done this every time because I think that on the negative, really what you're going to want to be doing on a lot of debates is arguing that there is an individual right to privacy, and that individual right is important. And that, nowhere does it apply more than this one, right? You really should have a right to privacy about intimate, personal, past details of your personal life. And that really is an important individual right. But there's also another interesting argument. And basically, I thought that this argument was only the one article, right? But it's actually a lot of very recent articles just in the last couple days. But anyway, so I have the argument here as the genetics argument. So, Jack, do you know what the genetics argument is in the context of the resolution? You must, right?
In the context of genetic superiority or almost like eugenics politics.
Kind of. So have any of you all read the Green and Anas article?
No.
Is that the one that's published in the medical journal?
Yeah. That's the one that's like the genetic
like,
right to privacy.
Yes.
Candidates or something. You have. Okay.
Yeah.
So can you just explain to me what the argument is? Now, and again, it's about medical records, and it's kind of the same thing as the discrimination point. But what is the specific argument it's making?
The way I understood it, I'm pretty sure it's the same article. It was saying that some genes, I guess, some people have certain genes that make them predisposed to more likely have things like heart disease and things like that. So the argument is that I think the argument ended up flowing negative, and I think it ended up saying that candidates shouldn't be forced. I think it was pitching like hypothetically in the future, if we live in a society like Gattaca, they shouldn't be forced to disclose their specific genes, because that's like a violation of their privacy. But the reason why people would want them to disclose those genes, which is I think what you're asking about, is because it can show if they're predisposed to certain illnesses.
Yeah, that is exactly right. So basically the article, which is an article by Green and Anas, and it's called, I believe, in 2008, called, and I highly recommend you look it up, called The Genetic Privacy of Presidential Candidates. And the argument in the article is, as Charles said, basically just that in the future, when you disclose things like your medical records, people will be able to figure out, based on those records, what predispositions you have for certain illnesses and not, And the effect that has is it'll allow people to do some of the things that Lindsey was talking about in terms of it being, in terms of sort of targeting you for discrimination, and to say that, oh, you are maybe likely to get this thing in the future. Now, here's the thing. It's really timely there because I believe this was this week. Jack, please correct me if I'm wrong, or anyone who knows about this, but didn't Elizabeth Warren just release her genetic information?
Yes,
to prove that she was Native American? I literally saw an article, and this, by the way, is really great advice for those of you at home that you may not get on another podcast. But I was researching that today, and there are articles that cite the Green and Anas article specifically from like 2 days ago about the Elizabeth Warren thing, and say, this proves the Elizabeth Warren thing is a reality, or the opposite. The Elizabeth Warren thing proves that this thing that Green and Anas were talking about is a reality. Like, literally, the argument is in the news.
Wow.
This article's in the news. Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy. Wow.
This isn't PF where a lot of the stuff actually just is in the news, right? Whereas this is not. This is rare. But yeah, this is a really timely issue. People are writing about it now. Specifically, if you want to find stuff about it, look for genetic McCarthyism on Google News. Okay. So we've spent a lot of time talking about affirmative positions. I can already tell that this is a podcast episode that is going to go long, but I love it. We can get you guys as much information as we possibly can. We'll be back with negative arguments. Stay with us. All right, let's move on to some negative arguments. So the one that we've obviously been referencing for a long time is the individual rights neg. Now, the whole point why people love privacy so much is that it is really a vital individual right. Now, there was a debate for a long time of whether it was in the Constitution, right? And for a long time, it wasn't. And then sort of people said, oh, it's sort of vaguely in the Constitution and it's important for a bunch of other rights. Specifically, I think one of the legal doctrines was that it was in the shadow of a bunch of different rights. I think they used the term shadow from a Supreme Court opinion. But basically, as Jack already explained eloquently earlier, the right to privacy has to do with control over information, what you should have control over. And some things about your personal life are intimate, and you have a right to keep those things. So I think that what would be the most productive for us to talk about is exactly what individual rights are intersected. Now, Jack, you mentioned property rights. Can you elaborate on how your privacy rights intersect with property rights in meaningful ways?
Absolutely. Is that, as I alluded to earlier, the way that we conceptualize privacy usually relies around an idea of property, of like being able to control different idea, or at least at the minimum, control information about you or knowledge about you that other people can't possess. And it seems as though I would say that when we talk about the a restriction of privacy, it may not be a physical harm that can exist in terms of, okay, you're not being like punched, right? But
and that's the weird part about this, right? Is that like, so I think when people think property initially, right, they're like, oh, like where's the soda bottle you took away from me? That was mine, you know? Like, did you take $5 from me? And privacy is a little different from that. But for some people, it really isn't, that it is a form of property. Can you kind of explain why?
Yeah, so I think that the way we see privacy as property is really kind of almost like a psychological kind of not violence, but a psychological view or a psychological property of oneself to determine who one is, right? That I want to be called Jack. I want to, say that I'm a debate coach. Those are labels that I control, and I think that ability to control things or to be able to know that to know things about my identity is necessary for someone to be a subject, which I think kind of leads into a key kind of negative argument about how important is privacy to a moral person, or to a rather, to be more specific, a subject in a democracy. How important is privacy? And I think that's a key question negatives should really focus on.
So I want to just talk about privacy rights generally, because I really want us to hone in on something, because I think that this topic has the potential, even with this argument, to really lead people astray. Okay, so this topic is about a right to privacy, and a lot of the justifications for right to privacy sound something like this: that a privacy right is good because it gives you sort of room to breathe. It gives you a space from which to exist separate from the prying eyes of the public. And specifically, it gets you to a position where you are where you can differentiate yourself from the government, where you can be your own individual private unit that is separate from the public. Now, a lot of arguments for privacy rights are worded in this way, but they really worry me as negative warrants. And here's so Lindsey and Jack and Charles, let me see if I can just sell you on this, and let me know if this makes sense. But sure. I don't think that this is 100% true, so feel free to challenge me on it. But my basic thought is that it is not strategic to make those arguments for privacy, because these are candidates. They're running for public office. They are, in a sense, embracing the publicity aspect of this. That's a choice they made. It's a choice they made to go into the public, to become a public figure. And so if your argument why privacy is good is that privacy is good because it gives people space away from government, I think that argument is a lot less persuasive in the context of the resolution.
See, I think it's really interesting then to be able to pose the question of like how much information then do they agree to, or like do you agree to all information if you become a candidate? Because I would say candidates
very difficult.
Yeah, wouldn't consent to that. They wouldn't consent to a full invasion of privacy, and that on some level a candidate still has to be a person who can like have their own individual projects. To kind of have independent of fear of judgment.
Yeah, and I think that's a definite potential affirmative response.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, what do you all think, Lindsey and Charles?
Kind of like I mean I definitely agree with you, Martin, but I think that too, when someone decides to run for public office, they, regardless of if they're conservative or liberal or how much privacy they think that they'll have, they still know that they're going to have less.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a question of how much.
How much less?
Yes. Like, I think that they know that when they do run for public office, that they are going to be in a fishbowl and that they are a public spectacle. But it's just a question of how much privacy, which I feel like the affirmative like is going to need to outline.
Yeah, and Charles, what do you think? And then I'm going to talk about something Lindsey said.
Yeah, I think it definitely is a contradiction to say that, they should have space from the government but they are being elected to the government, so they're obviously going to be a public spectacle. I think that additionally, even if like aside that contradiction, just on top of that against this argument is that it's simply a question of outweighing. This is like more generally, I guess we'll get to this about beating back this NC, but it's a question of like outweighing one's right to privacy if they are a candidate, especially when they're a candidate, like kind of in conjunction with that contradiction argument. With that in mind, it's very easy to outweigh, I think, with the AF.
Yeah, so let's actually get into this right now, because I definitely think that, Jack is right. Maybe you don't give up every right to privacy, but you do, as Lindsey said, give up some of those, Lindsey and Charles. And
right.
as Charles said, it's really important to examine the specific context and do some weighing. So let's talk about this argument, how you should write it, and also at the same time talk about how you answer it. Because when you're writing this NC, it's really important that you respond to the following sort of objection, right? Your argument cannot just be that privacy is always good in every single context. Because again, people give up some of those privacy rights when they run for office. And also, the resolution is a very narrow, specific case. It's not just privacy good, it's privacy in this conflict good, which means that as the negative, you need to be able to give a very clear answer to the question that Lindsey asked. How much privacy do you get? How much privacy do they expect? How much privacy do they really deserve? The answer to that question, I think, will really determine these rounds. And like, here's another thing, right? So as we were talking about before, I do not have privacy rights about everything. So if your argument is just that people should have privacy rights generally and privacy rights are always good in every context, then it's just really easy to lose the debate in cross-ex. And when you're debating this position, you should make them lose the debate in cross-ex. Just be like, do I have the right to privacy about whether or not I own 10 gigs of child pornography?
Yeah.
Do I? No, obviously not, right? And if they say yes, they're just going to lose, right? And if they say no, they're also going to lose, which is why it's a really bad thing. You can't just be absolutist about it. You need to say, in the case of this conflict, it's really important. And that means, guys, and I really want the listeners to understand this, when you are writing this position, and you should, because it's a good position, it's really where a lot of the negative arguments lie, you need to be very clear, as Charles and Lindsey both pointed out, that the resolution is a significant deprivation of privacy.
Right.
Not just that it is a deprivation, right? Because lots of things deprive privacy. For example, you going to prison deprives you of privacy rights, right? But you should still go to prison, and you don't have privacy rights about whether you lock people in your basement. You don't have privacy rights about everything, and those privacy rights can be overridden. So why this time should we not override them? Why is this a really important issue? So when you are debating, you should say privacy is important, of course, and you should make some of those arguments. By the way, so Jack put a lot of them in the context of property rights. I agree, and specifically in that literature, I advocate that you all look at arguments in the context of autonomy, okay? That people should still have the right to choose their own destinies, regardless of whether they give up things for public office. I'm just a little worried about the identity away from the government kinds of arguments. So I think those arguments get you into some risky territory. Obviously, they still work, and Jack of course disagrees. But yeah. So anyway, that was just a big combined. How do you write this argument? Plus how do you write this argument? Plus how do you answer it? Which is to say that it's not absolute, and that as the affirmative, you should be able to plausibly argue that you don't have a right to privacy about everything. Sometimes individual rights give way, and you should sort of account for that. All right, now let's for a criterion. You all think something like respecting individual rights is good. Obviously, you can't just make it the resolution. Don't make it like respecting privacy rights.
Yeah.
Probably just like respecting individual rights, or if you want to get fancy, you can call it libertarianism. How you research it, look for stuff that says privacy is good. Look for stuff that says the candidates really should have a privacy right to it and that they shouldn't have to give it up. That's easy.
Right.
The articles that privacy is good, you can go on regular Google, but you can use Google Scholar for that too. But the stuff about how the resolution deprives privacy primarily is going to be on news sites, especially kind of the tax returns, medical information stuff. All right, so in terms of how you answer it, and you all have to forgive me, I'm going a little fast because I know the episode has taken a long time. So how do you answer it? We've already gone over the first argument. Privacy rights are not absolute. They should be overridden in specific contexts. So I have another argument, and maybe you all can sort of help me with it. So in the context of democracy, Jack, so it is kind of easy to argue that democracy is important to respect individual rights in much the way that this argument describes. Can you kind of go into why?
I apologize. What do you mean by this?
So obviously one of the major affirmative arguments is about democratic ideals. And I think one argument you could make is that really a selling point of democracy is its respect for individual rights.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore that we should respect and therefore that if you want to achieve the negative criterion of respecting individual rights, really voting affirmative is a good way of doing that. Like the voters have rights too. Stuff like that. Do you kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a very intuitive way to be able to respond to this type of negative position. I also think that we alluded to this earlier as well. But I think one of the most persuasive responses is that we know that the candidates know that the rights or the privacy is going to be violated on some level, and they've already consented to that claim, just as citizens have consented to their authority or would consent to their authority. So it seems as though it's kind of like a mutual consent that would exist between a citizen and a candidate, which means that a lot of times, if we want to protect the rights of candidates, the rights of citizens, it seems like you could affirm under this framework.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I really liked how you put it. Individuals have rights too, and we should be able to ensure that those are respected. By the way, just another argument against this is just all the normal arguments against individual rights NCs about how, for example, you don't have individual rights about everything. Those aren't absolute. For example, taxes. And that, by the way, is really the tricky part about this NC is that basically all of its arguments are super vague in general, but they really can't be. Because if your argument is just that people should have individual rights to everything, you'll just lose because your argument's too extreme. All right. So let's move into the second negative argument. I have this flagged as utilitarianism. And there are really two different arguments. And one of them we've already talked about, the argument about distractions. Okay. So that argument was that ultimately it makes the quality of elections and democratic discourse worse to just flood people with a bunch of informations. Because people are kind of bad at making decisions. They're red herrings, as Lindsey alluded to. And that will cause them to vote for potentially worse candidates, which will make society worse off. Utilitarianism, of course, is the belief that that happiness should be maximized and pain should be minimized in a very consequence-focused way. So the argument is that overall, it turns out that actually giving all this information really makes things go worse. It leads to less good things. Now, who before the podcast talked about the chilling effect argument? Who kind of wants to explain that? I forget who it was. Was it Jack? I forget.
It actually wasn't me.
Okay, so which one of you then was making the argument that like qualified good candidates just won't run for office if all of their personal history could potentially be exposed?
That actually wasn't me, but I'd be happy to talk about it.
Charles?
Lindsey, was it you?
No, I don't think it was me either, which is why I'm confused.
Interesting. Well,
I'm pretty sure it was Jack, but
Oh no.
I'll just
Oh.
I'll just get into it anyways.
okay, sure.
So the argument basically is this. So this kind of goes to an argument that Jack was making earlier, which is that if you shouldn't have to sacrifice literally every right you have as a person, to run for public office. And one of the effects that has is utilitarian, which is it scares people off. Maybe someone would be a great leader, but they sought help for depression when they were 19, right? It's like maybe those people, instead of just losing the election, maybe they just never run. Maybe you have people with slightly spotty past that really got better and would really be good at governing the nation. Or maybe they didn't do anything wrong. Maybe they're just worried, though, because they don't want all of the negative media attention. They don't want people zooming in on an embarrassing medical condition, even if the medical condition isn't even bad. Maybe they just don't want literally everyone in the country to know about their family's history of dementia, right? Those are very reasonable things. And there are some people that make the argument that would lead less good, qualified decision makers for running for office. And that has a utilitarian effect because it just makes the quality of the people who are holding office just worse. And ultimately, those people make worse decisions, and they're governing, if not the nation, then parts of it at least. As far as criterions for this argument, you want utilitarianism for sure, some form of consequentialism. You could have something like improving government decision making. That's really just sort of a stand-in for utilitarianism, but you can totally do that. As far as research, sorry, go ahead. Someone wants to say something.
Do you think rule utilitarianism would be like I don't know any specific I don't know. I was having a discussion with another coach talking about a way to negate would rather not to act utilitarianism but rule utilitarianism.
I think rule utilitarianism would work in the context of a modified libertarianism position.
Okay.
Right? So rule utilitarianism, we don't really have time to explain it in that much detail on the podcast, but basically it's the argument that instead of looking at what individual acts promote utility, your argument is that we should just accept constraints on our action, general rules that if everyone followed them most of the time would promote utility. And once we have those rules, we shouldn't question them in individual cases. For example, if it's good, this is the way that laws work in the United States. So, for example, it might be better in any one individual case sometimes for someone to steal from somebody else. But you can't allow for stealing from somebody else because then that undermines the general rule. Then everyone can steal and everyone's worse off. So it's best to sort of have general rules that you just prohibit yourself from violating because that rule in general promotes the best utility if everyone did it. And I think you can make an argument for that for privacy, Jack. You could say, in general, the rule of don't violate people's privacy is just a good rule and we should follow it.
Yeah.
And that rule is utilitarian. Generally respecting people's privacy rights would be an effective utilitarian concern. And that concern should be weighed against should the default be to disclose or should the default be to keep it private? And I think you could easily argue that the default should be to keep it private. And again, that would help you out because you would be able to abstract away from specific cases.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, just to really quickly go back to libertarianism, one of the strengths of the libertarianism, just like with the democratic ideals case, is that you can leverage the argument that we talked about how the resolution says in a democracy, not the United States. You can leverage the resolution's vagueness. If their argument is just about the US, for example, you can very easily say, the resolution shouldn't be only about the United States. We should debate about all of them. Your case is too specific. My case is not, because it's just generally about why privacy is good. As far as utilitarianism is concerned, as far as how do you answer it, I think that basically, number one, you outweigh it with the democracy argument, right? You say that people are just actually, all this distraction, chilling effect stuff really isn't that significant in the grand scheme of things, and that overall putting people in office to be democratically accountable is good. And maybe you can outweigh it with some of the medical record stuff also, right? You can say like, maybe these things are people, should be discouraged from running office for. You kind of impact turn their argument by being like, actually, yes, people who do have sort of risky medical conditions, maybe they'd be deterred from running for office, but that's a good thing because maybe then they don't mess things up. And the second argument is obviously just that utilitarianism is inaccurate. You can argue that your criterion sort of defeats it in any way, and these arguments are very classic. And you should feel free to make those arguments on this topic. And also, sorry, go ahead.
No,
No.
I just wanted to add in terms of beating back utilitarianism, especially if you're defending an affirmative that talks about democracy and like democratic principles. I think that a lot of the common utilitarianism justifications, such as Gooden and Waller talk about, it's the government's obligation to use utilitarianism. But I think that it's pretty easy and convincing to make a claim that the government wouldn't be able to function properly, utilitarianism or not, without proper engagement with the public. So the AF is a prerequisite. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that argument's great. Argue that your framework is better, especially for democracy. Upholding democracy and its strength really would affect utilitarianism in a positive way. I mean,
Right.
Democracy is utilitarian. The fact that we have it is that.
Right. Sure.
All right. So again, just to get through this last point, and we said that we talk about it. So even though the podcast is running long, we are going to spend some time talking about it. So Lindsey, what is I have this argument labeled as discrimination. Really, it's an argument about ableism.
Yeah.
Can you just sort of very briefly, obviously I don't want we don't need the history of the whole thing, although you're very knowledgeable about this subject. You could probably very much get into it. I mean, I did judge you reading it in debate, so I'm pretty sure you know what it is. But just in general, what is it and what's the core controversy on the topic?
So ableism generally, when you hear this term, people also say disableism, but I would kind of regard them as like the same argument. Ableism entails like discrimination of disabled individuals. So this could be anywhere from buildings not being accessible, that being ableist, to the medical records AF, and people saying that president or just candidates in general ought to disclose mental health records, that stigmatizes disabled individuals, and that's bad because it leads to poor treatment of disabled individuals, along with just discrimination and marginalization. So that's generally.
Yeah, definitely. And so I'm going to kind of just ask you to explain some of the key points there, because I think that I think this argument, by the way, is very good. But I do think that it's easy to misunderstand what the argument actually is. So you mentioned that. So here's kind of a hypothetical. Based on your understanding of American society, if someone released that they had depression today, right? Do you think the response from the majority of Americans? So how about this? What do you wish the response for the majority of Americans would be to that? Like, oh, you had depression in the past. Like, what do you think?
I wish that there wouldn't really be a response, and that it could be something that would be perceived as like, okay, like kind of accepting, and that a lot of people like go through similar things, so it's not something that they should be treated any differently. Or so either like no reaction, I feel like would be a good thing, because it would prove that like people are neutral and don't like actively hate disabled individuals, because sometimes it seems like in the media that they do. Or like coming out and actually being supportive of them, and like actively promoting the idea that it is okay to seek treatment for depression or any other type of mental illness and still be a public office candidate. So I think that those would be like the two good responses. Obviously, the other response would be like political backlash and a repeat pretty much of the Thomas Eagleton scandal, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. And by the way, those kind of optimistic views of what the public would do, those are an affirmative argument against this, but they are mostly rooted, I believe, in perhaps overambitious optimism. And so when you say political backlash, it's really like a lot worse than that statement makes it sound.
Yeah, I think that there are several different types of groups, I guess, that could produce this backlash. First being anybody who's running against them would probably use that in some type of negative advertisement. And like even media outlets describing Donald Trump and like why he like isn't the best, regardless of any type of political affiliation. The things that a lot of the media were saying about Trump were like really bad for disabled individuals, like people calling him crazy, people calling him impulsive. And there are different ways that you can criticize political candidates without being ableist. And I think that that's going to be like a really important argument, is that you can criticize like Trump, for example, of maybe like if he's impulsive, you could say that like he's aggressive, or like describing his behavior as opposed to trying to explain where that comes from, because then it like becomes a question of debaters being like a psychiatrist when none of us are professionals. We're all just like speculating. And then that just kind of leads to a dangerous environment for disabled individuals.
For sure. I mean, like there are tons of just like internet hot takes about mental illness that I think really like did the community they were trying to protect, or maybe even weren't trying to protect, really just like really did them dirty. I mean, in just saying like, look at this person, he's obviously crazy and should be diagnosed and institutionalized, right? It's like, right, not good. But yeah, so it'll probably lead to some form of discrimination, and I really like that you brought up the Eagleton thing, right? Because that is really what like it proves this. Whenever this stuff happens, it usually is like, this is terrible. How can we have this person running our country? And here's the thing, right? If your affirmative's argument is about medical records, that will be their argument. Their argument is there are people with disabilities. They shouldn't run for office. They're unfit to serve. Right?
Yeah. And then that begs the question of like, who is fit to serve? What does it mean to be fit to serve? What does it mean to be healthy? So I think that the ableism argument can be run in a multitude of ways, but kind of just boiling it down to two. One of criticizing like the scholarship of the affirmative and like advocating that you should drop the debater based on the scholarship that they produce, and like endorsing their scholarship would be a bad thing because it would lead to perpetuation of like whatever norms they discuss. And using it more of like a critical route that a lot of progressive debaters do, or just a more general argument being like, hey, the way that you're framing your arguments and the arguments that you're making are bad for disabled individuals and lead to more political backlash like for them. And just leads to backlash against the community in general, which I think could be impacted out as more of a utilitarian scenario.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even just have to be about your rhetoric, right? I mean, this actually just like, because that's the thing, right? Sometimes when people think about ableism, they just think, oh, like it's just a bunch of dirty word arguments, like you shouldn't say this word or whatever. But on this topic, it's definitely not just that, right? It's actually just like a core negative argument against people disclosing their medical records, that it will lead to in real world discrimination against disabled folk. Right? And it's just like, and has in the past. So we shouldn't do the resolution because it would produce ableism in society. So let's talk about how you would write the argument. So first of all, there's a bunch of literature that says this, first of all. I want to talk about one sort of component of the argument in terms of how you would write it, okay? So one of the affirmative arguments, Charles,
Yes.
that I could imagine people making is something like, well, something like, oh, individuals disclosing their medical records could be a form of saying, hey, like, look, I'm willing to do this myself, and we should all sort of destigmatize mental illness. I'm this candidate you all like, and it turns out I had depression in the past. And I can imagine affirmative saying like, oh, we should use that to destigmatize mental illness, that's a good thing.
Okay.
But also,
right.
That's not the resolution, is it?
No, it's not.
And why isn't it?
Because the resolution is specifically questioning it's just not a question of that. It's a question of the public's right to know, and you can argue that the public doesn't really have a right to know that.
Well, here's the thing, right? It's like so Lindsey, right? This is obviously a very basic question, right? But so let's talk about this in the context of the LGBTQ plus community. Okay? So is there a difference between coming out of the closet and being forced out of the closet?
Yes.
Huge difference, right? Huge difference. And so if the affirmative's argument is just like, yeah, it would be great if people voluntarily gave up their medical records. Is that what the topic is?
Absolutely not. The topic is a question of whether or not it's a value statement of which is more important. And
well, it's also like the public making them do it, right?
Yes.
The public is like, you don't want to release this. We're going to make you do it. Oh, you have depression. Let's castigate you. Like, there's a real sense in which it's a lot of the affirmative responses to it will assume that they have a choice. They don't. That's not the resolution.
Exactly. But I also think, too, in regards to the way that you constructed that argument, about, well, it would be a nice idea if they voluntarily did this, that doesn't take into account the other portion of the resolution that is the public's right to know.
Right.
Which I think would be like a huge deficit in trying to affirm.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Well, we've sort of talked at length about how you write it. There's really a lot of research about this, especially there's a ton of research about ableism and disability studies as well, if you want to get into that.
The easiest, I think, to research on this topic.
I agree. As far as criterions, I recommend something like minimizing discrimination and something like that. And that way, you can talk about how discrimination is unfair and how it's unjust. And then your contentions, you can just argue that this is what will happen to folks if you affirm. There will be more discrimination against them on the basis of something that they really don't have control over and that is used to harm them personally. Okay, so we're close to the end, I promise. So how do you answer this argument? I suggest a couple of things. Number one is you could kind of go through the argument directly. I recommend this mostly in traditional debates. You could just argue that yes, maybe these people are sort of differently abled, and maybe they still shouldn't be in office. Maybe because it really does make them worse about decision making and stuff. You can kind of take the utilitarian view. I think that in a lot of progressive debates, this argument would go very poorly, so you should not make it. You'd probably lose. But in traditional debates, you can probably still get away with arguing that ultimately the quality of decision making is for somehow more important than discrimination. Or you could argue that discrimination isn't really that bad of an impact or something like that. Now, again, you definitely should not stake the debate on that, because I don't think you're on really the right side of the issue. Another thing you could say is that, and you all should chime in right after this, because, but another thing you could very easily say is just to kind of, if your affirmative is vague, is just to go the kind of medical records, not in every country, resolution is vague route. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
In a democracy, hey, you don't know whether in India you have medical confidentiality rights for candidates. In the Netherlands you don't, or maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know, right? So you can kind of try and get out of it that way. You can say that medical records are not part of the resolution, etc. Do you all have better arguments to answer this?
I think that's
general arguments.
Yeah, I think that's basically what you got to do. I do think this case is strong, and that you all should strongly consider researching it. Okay, so that is the negative arguments on the topic. We've already gone over some affirmative arguments, and when we return, we'll go to the only important part of our segment, the mini debates, and we'll thank our guests for being on. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming on. I know this has been a really marathon of an episode, but you all have really been great guests and great troopers. Thank you all so much for coming on, Jack, Lindsey, Charles.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
You all were awesome. I hope to have you on shortly. Thank you again to our sponsor, Victory Briefs, for providing the gear and hosting support for this episode. They're a great camp. You should totally check out their stuff. Their briefs are good, and their camp is good. Please go. Okay, now to the only important segment of our podcast, the mini debate. So, all right, the topic for this one is who is the best debate coach?
Ooh.
So I know this will be really difficult for you, Lindsey and Charles. So I'm going to give you some time to prepare. But so I guess first I'll start with myself. The best debate coach for me is George Clements. He really shaped my sort of view on things, and he's great, and he's the reason why I am where I am today. Okay, now Lindsey and Charles, your turn.
Great. I'll go. So I think that Jack is the best debate coach.
Jack Ave, our very own?
Our very own Jack Ave. The one that blessed us in this podcast today. Yeah, Jack has shaped who I am as a person and who I am as a debater, and I would not have had any, not nearly any, but just any of the success in general without Jack. And honestly, I probably wouldn't even be getting through like school and just life right now without Jack. So not only is he like a good debate coach, but he's also just a great life coach.
Okay.
Yeah. So am I good to go?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. I think that Jack is really everything that I can ask for and more in terms of, a friend and when I was debating a debate coach, and even when Lindsey and I were doing college policy, he was like still there helping us out with stuff when we needed him, which I like am very appreciative for.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was really cool.
After rounds.
Yeah, exactly. And he would subscribe to us on Tab Room and stuff like that. And yeah, it's really good. But no, I'm like Jack just knows what's up. He really like I think Lindsey and I both like he really connected to us on a personal level. Like, we're all from small schools. We all got one bid to the TOC. We're all just like kind of like in the same boat, and he just like really connected with us, and I'll just never forget that.
Oh, guys, thank you so much.
All right. So unless Jack votes for George Clemens, in which case we have a tie, then I think you're gonna win, Jack, no matter what you do. So so you might as well just throw in a symbolic vote for someone who was your best debate coach.
I'll you know what? I'll throw in, I'm gonna throw in a symbolic coach to my high school coach, Greg Stevens. He is retired now. But he was someone who, regardless of different financial problems that my school had or even students had, he made sure that no student on the team had to pay for tournaments at all. And regardless of it, he used his own money, and he like personally drove me in his own car to go to the TOC, like from Iowa. And I will never ever be able to thank him enough for the opportunities he's had. To give me access to the national circuit debate stage, which has allowed me to coach, meet people like Lindsey, Charles, like you, Sigalo, like all the way back in like 2010, right, when we met. So yeah, I would say Greg Stevens for sure.
Those are some heartfelt words from all of our people, but despite Jack's plea for Greg Stevens, ultimately it is one vote of two, and therefore is defeated. So you heard it here. It's official. Argument Clinic podcast. Jack Ave best coach.
Thanks.
There you go. I mean, it's kind of a rigged election, but
a little biased. But I'm glad that you all have the right to information. I'm glad you have the right to know things about me.
Oh.
I don't know. You have an infringement.
And you're a candidate in the election of our hearts. So.
Are you alluding to a potential candidacy in the future in Iowa?
Who knows? That's going to be on the next episode.
Oh, okay.
Speaking of the next episode, as most of you all know, we do a thing at the end of our podcast. We have a catchphrase that I said one time because it annoyed Lawrence, and now we say it every time for that exact reason. So on the phrase we say is "stay frosty," but you have to really emphasize the A. Stay frosty. So it would be great if you could all say it together.
Oh yeah, at the end, when Lawrence was at the NDT, wasn't everyone posting this on his timeline?
Well, yeah, that's because I did #Stay Frosty.
Okay, I think
I was like, hey guys, write #Stay Frosty to sort of support him.
Yeah, I didn't even know what it meant, and I did it anyway.
Everyone did it. It ignored him so much. I love it. You all should do that immediately. Anyways, so on the count of three, I want you to all say "Stay Frosty" to conclude the podcast.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
Stay frosty.
All right. Well, that's good enough. See you all next week.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.